Hello, friends. Hello, hello. It is Friday. We made it to the end of another week. I'm so glad y'all are here. Typically, when I do these live spaces, I spend the first 2 to 3 minutes running a kind of starting soon video with music. And I've done that because I find that it helps to kind of level out the stream before I get going. But I also think that people will tune in, see the timer, and then leave because they don't like the music or something. Because I'll be honest, I don't have great taste in music, right? I like music that a lot of people don't really tend to like. I mean, it's not bluegrass or anything, but it's, I like a lot of hip hop, stuff like that. So at any rate, we're going to see how this turns out at the end, but we're going straight into it from the intro. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about James McDonald. Now, we have had a brief space about James McDonald before. James McDonald was a professor at Arizona State, I believe it was, and I'm sorry, University of Arizona. And he was part of the UFO research field back in the kind of late 50s and 60s when there's a lot of interesting stuff being discovered then as well. He was actually part of what some call like the first kind of UAP hearings, right? This was in 1968. It was called the Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects. And it had people like J. Allen Hynek, Carl Sagan, Robert Hall, Dr. Harder, Dr. Baker, and the list goes on and on. So this was a hearing they had in 1968. I can't decide the best way I want to cover it because the bummer about this one is that it was not filmed. We can't find any, recorded versions. There was no C-SPAN in 1968. So I'm figuring out the best way to present this to you all, whether it would be to do kind of AI voices, make a cartoon, just kind of go through it, highlighting and reading the interesting parts. Not really sure how I want to approach that yet. But we're definitely going to take some time one of these days and go through this symposium on unidentified flying objects that took place in 1968. For now, though, we're going to go through some of this stuff that was released on James McDonald. And I'm going to start with some papers that came out. So you see this says the Air Graham Department of Army, I believe that says, has kind of been stamped over. Unclassified, Department of State. And this is from the Moscow Embassy. The subject is flying saucers are a myth. And then somebody hand wrote in there, in parentheses, or maybe a mythos. Very interesting, right? Who wrote that? Reference Moscow's A1095, February 20th, 1968. It says a long article in Moskovsky Komsoplets. If you're Russian, you've probably already tuned out. You hate me right now. February 16th, 1968, by Williamsburg science editor of the... Oh, let me zoom in just a little bit, because I'm having a hard time reading this. Flying saucers says Lyetsburg appear to those who believe in them, but persistently stay away from air observation posts, meteorologists, and astronomers. Lyetsburg, in fact, is quite empathetic throughout his article that unidentified flying objects, UFO, do not exist. He makes No attempt to square his belief with previously published Soviet articles, including that rather spectacular article primarily for U.S. consumption in Soviet life. And then it says to see reference. So this is obviously a journalist who's, I guess, written a few pieces on UFOs from Moscow. And I think this is just the actual article. They just kind of put it in, or maybe highlights from the article. It says, in the last 20 years, publication of literature on unidentified flying objects has advanced to one of the first places in the world. This problem is dealt by numerous associates and clubs. Are these flying saucers just imagination or reality? Thousands of recorded statements by eyewitnesses seem to show that there must be something in it. But let us try to look at all these materials from a different stand. So that's just a terrible copy, so I can't read that. Something of the saucer theory that almost every time you can draw your own conclusions while we give you. So this is translated to English from Russian. So, and it looks like maybe not a great translation. So I'm sure some of these sentences, the structure is going to sound strange, but just know that this is coming from Russia. So it says, facts only. Kenneth Arnold, an American pilot, is the godfather of flying saucers. It was he who noticed in 1947 9 shining discs flying in formation at the speed of about 3,000 kilometers an hour. The next encounter with saucers had a tragic outcome. In January 1948, an immense flying saucer appeared over the Knox U.S. Air Force Base. Pursuing it, Captain Thomas Mantle perished. The last thing he reported from an altitude of 9,000 meters was that he saw an object and he was going to approach it. This story found extensive response. Many considered it to be a stern warning of unknown envoys from other planets to leave them alone. There was a great deal of a talk about the mysterious death of the pilot. It was received as undoubted proof of the existence of mighty forces still unknown to us. But the results of a thorough investigation by U.S. authorities received much less publicity. The mysterious saucer proved to be nothing but a thin-walled plastic balloon made by U.S. naval forces under the secret Skyhawk Operation Project. Such balloons could rise to an altitude of 30,000 meters. Meanwhile, Thomas Mantle, pursuing it, forgot that he had no oxygen apparatus on board his craft. And I think we all know how that ended. We know the stories about encounters and even hand-to-hand fights with pilots of craft landing from other planets. Really. They were shot at, but without success. A saucer out down a tree on the Amazon River shore and disappeared in the turbid stream. It was never recovered. Another saucer glided over the earth like an injured bird and almost crashed before the eyes of witnesses. But having spit out several pieces of metal, it leveled out its course and flew off. Delivered to the police, the metal proved to be ordinary tin. Very interesting. Nothing but a saucer put out of commission a high-voltage power transmission line in 1965 and thus plunged several large American cities into darkness for 6 hours. And they have this circled. An abandoned silvery disc was found in the deep rock coal seams in Norwegian coal mines on Spitsbergen. I like saying that. Spitsbergen. It was pierced and marked by micrometer impacts and bore all traces of having performed a long space voyage. It was sent for analysis to the Pentagon and disappeared. Very interesting stuff. So this was one of the articles that was held on to with the James McDonald archives. And I will put the link after this video so you all can download this stuff if you want, but I would definitely recommend it. Certainly some interesting reading as we look at this next one here that talks about the government and UFOs. Further scientific investigations of UFOs is unwarranted, said the Air Force in 1980. So this is a paper from, let's see here, May 1981. And you see the headline there is a CIA stonewalling. Based on the 892 pages of UFO-related documents released to lawyer Peter Gersten, it's clear that the CIA's professed non-interest in UFOs is untrue. There is internal evidence of non-continuity within the CIA and even of other files of previous work. This is not surprising considering the highly compartmentalized nature of the agency. But periodic studies or reports or reviews were ordered, and UFO reports, foreign and domestic, were routinely monitored over long periods of time. We're not interested. We're just going to watch everything that's going on about it. The statement is sometimes made that the CIA has no formal study of UFOs other than the 1953 Robertson panel, but these documents show that the agency kept, and no doubt keeps, plenty of channels open to gather information, including an acknowledged channel into the 1966-68 University of Colorado UFO project. The documents also clearly indicate that in 1952 the CIA was prepared to mount a major scientific study of UFOs based on the extraordinary radar visual sightings that year, but that the debunking conclusion of the Robinson panel cut short that effort. In May 1953, following the Robertson panel report, P&E Division assumed responsibility for the OSI project on unidentified flying objects. A December 17, 1953 memo to Assistant Director Scientific Intelligence. A year later, the chief of P&E, that's physics and electronics, said he would maintain the OSI central file on such objects, which he did until August 55, according to an August 8, 55 memo to the Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence. After that, responsibility was assigned to the Applied Sciences Division, where W.E. Lexo, Division Chief, stated in a February 56 memo, a chronological file of all OSI correspondence and actions taken in the Air Force bases from Guam to Newfoundland. Another Air Force document reveals that the Air Force conducted an investigation into the incident, but found no explanation for their occurrence, so on and so forth. So this is again, to me, it's not so much the content. While the content is interesting, it's what gets kept and why. And as far as this article goes, they even underline certain portions. And the underlined portion says, in March 1967, an intercept technician with the U.S. Air Force Security Service intercepted a communication between the pilot of a Russian-made Cuban MiG-21 and his command concerning a UFO encounter. The technician has since stated that when the pilot attempted to fire at the object, the MiG and its pilot were destroyed by the UFO. Furthermore, the technician alleges that all reports, tapes, log entries, and notes on the incident were forwarded to the National Security Agency at their request. Not surprisingly, several months later, the agency drafted a report entitled UFO Hypothesis and Survival Questions. I actually have that guy downloaded. The agency concluded that no matter what UFO hypothesis is considered, all of them have serious survival implications. Comparing the UFO problem to a rattler on a forest path, the NSA report says you would have to treat the alarm as if it were a real and immediate threat to your survival. Very interesting. So the message, I mean, this was 81. So kind of that message of national defense, national security, and that these things are a threat has been there for a while. It's nothing new. It's the same old. Okay. We're going to watch a couple of these videos that the Australian government of all... like, why the Australian government has this, I don't know. But we're going to watch a couple of videos involving James McDonald from the Australian government that were recently released to the archives.
Recently, in recent editions, which have referred to...
And obviously, I'm going to have to clean the audio on that one up. That was terrible. Okay. I believe James McDonald's wife was able to go to one of these conferences and speak. Let's see here. Yeah, Dr. James E. McDonald's Fight for UFO Science. And this is the first annual Exopolitics Expo. Now we have one after this as well. That's from 05. So we'll check that one out as well. Good Lord. Definitely the 80s, right, folks? Okay, here we go.
Is, of course, Ann Druffel. Ann Druffel is a veteran UFO researcher. She's been active in the UFO research field since 1957. She is the author of the recently published book, which has been receiving rave reviews in the field from numerous sources. The book is Firestorm, Dr. James E. McDonald's Fight for UFO Science. And Ann is, she began investigating sighting reports in Southern California in the late 50s. She has researched over 2,000 Los Angeles Basin reports, including alleged landings, photo cases, close encounters with physical effects on witnesses and terrain, alleged abduction reports, and other extraterrestrial-related phenomena. She's a prolific writer. She's contributed to over 180 articles to numerous journals and magazines. She wrote the book, How to Defend Yourself Against Alien Abductions, and The Psychic and the Detective. She is also a freelancer in various aspects of psychic research. From 1986 to 1991, she worked as research assistant, consultant researcher with the Los Angeles-based parapsychology lab, Mobius Society. And she has also written numerous articles on a variety of psychic phenomena and, of course, her books. She raised 5 children while investigating UFOs. It's my pleasure now to welcome Ann Druffel.
Thank you, Cheryl. Does everyone hear me? What you see on the screen is the cover of my book, Firestorm, and it introduces to you Dr. James E. McDonald, a most remarkable scientist. In the spring of 1966, James E. McDonald publicly entered the UFO research field. He set about trying to use his influence in order to convince the scientific establishment that UFOs were a serious question that was being badly neglected. He was a top research scientist with powerful contacts in the government, the military, and the scientific establishment. He fully expected that he could use his impeccable reputation and his research skills to change things around so that the scientific community would launch a well-funded effort to find out and report the truth. He felt strongly, always, that the public had the right to know. Now, during the next 5 years, from 1966 on, his research methods, plus his particular talents and skills, and his remarkable sociable personality, brought him to the very door of disclosure. He tackled the same problems we're all struggling with today. He encountered walls of resistance, such as we encounter, but he possibly got closer to the truth than anyone ever has or has since. Now, next, please. And the media, even the elite media, gave him constant favorable and objective coverage. Most of you here recognize his name and know that he was important historically. And a few of you here tonight knew him personally as I did and worked with him in the field between 1966 and 1971. But a lot of the information in my book, Firestorm, Dr. James E. McDonald's fight for UFO science, no one ever knew before. It is an authorized biography of McDonald's UFO research years. When I archived his voluminous UFO files 10 years ago and interviewed dozens of his academic colleagues, I didn't know a lot of the things in the book either, but there they were, tucked away in files that had been guarded by his family for 20 years, and in including 4 handwritten journals that no one even knew existed. The next one. Now, this is the public persona of Jim McDonald. It's the photo he apparently liked best. Actually, it's the one before, I'm sorry, because it's the one he made available to the public whenever they asked. Could you put back the one? I'm sorry. This is his professor look. He was born in Duluth, Minnesota in 1920, and he served in the Navy during World War II in a cryptographic unit in in the Pacific area during the war with Japan. After the war, he married Betsy Hunt, next one please, who'd been in the Navy too. Now, she told me that she fell in love first with his love for words. They had 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters. He got his PhD in physics and meteorology in 1951 and rose quickly in his field. In 1954, next one please, the University of Chicago sent him to establish the new Institute of Atmospheric Physics on the campus of the University of Arizona at Tucson. His office was on the roof closest to the sky. He was the Institute's co-director for the first 2 years, but he wasn't happy administrating. He loved to research and to teach, and so he stepped down to senior physicist, and this was the title he held until his death in 1971. He established the undergraduate and the graduate levels of the meteorology department at the university and guided many students through their own doctoral studies. He was a prodigious writer. Referee journals like Science and Nature published many of his technical papers, and he presented many papers on cloud physics and climate modification before top scientific groups. Next one, please. But he didn't stop there. His basic philosophy was that science existed to serve the people. And so he also wrote non-technical articles in magazines like Scientific American, explaining complicated concepts like electricity in plain English. He had a way of using words so that anyone could understand him. The most important thing, perhaps, is that McDonald avoided the politics of science and always concentrated on searching out the truth of scientific questions wherever he met them. Consequently, he never fully realized the politics lying behind government non-disclosure. And perhaps this actually helped bring about his early death at the age of 51. Nevertheless, McDonald remains the kind of leader we need today to pursue government disclosure. By studying his experiences with, quote, government resistance, which seemed in his case to amount to an orchestrated attack, we can avoid such tragedies in the future, hopefully. Now, McDonald's professor look that I showed you before, he didn't really look like that. He was one of these people who looked different in different photos. Next, please. This one shows a little bit of his extremely sociable nature. It's from the same photo session as the professor look, but the real McDonald is starting to come through here. I think someone tried to make him laugh here, for he had a sense of humor that was completely unexpected and sometimes totally off the wall. Next, please. Now, this unposed photo is like we remember him. He's gazing out the window of his rooftop office. He was 42 at the time and at the peak of his career. It was 1961, and he was being interviewed about the first controversy in which he had involved himself with the U.S. Air Force. Now, McDonald was bluntly outspoken whenever he saw science being neglected and the American people in danger. And that's why he involved himself in what became known as the Titan missile controversy. McDonald never avoided controversy. He was fearless. He was described as one of the academic colleagues that I interviewed as, quote, a man made out of steel. In 1960, the Air Force began to ring American cities with defensive atomic missiles. Thank you. In case the Cold War with the Soviet Union turned hot. the Air Force wasn't even taking into account the simple fact of prevailing winds. McDonald tried multiple times to try to explain to them, to the government and to the Air Force, that if you put nuclear missiles all around a city, next please, which they did. They put nuclear missiles all around Tucson, and that's where his family lived. And if an enemy launched an attack at those missile sites, there would be nuclear explosions all around the city, and prevailing winds would shower radioactivity all over the city. Now, McDonald tried to tell them that, logically. Missile silos should be placed downwind so that prevailing winds would sweep radioactive debris away from the population. He testified before congressional hearings on these subjects several times, but it was a fight he didn't win at first. The Air Force went ahead and ringed Tucson and a dozen other American cities, but gradually, however, McDonald's logic won out. And by 1963, missile silos were being placed downwind of major American cities. Now, back to his involvement with UFOs. Beginning in 1958, he quietly began investigating UFO reports around Tucson and explained about 98% of Tucson sightings as conventional objects or atmospheric effects. But the remaining 2% he couldn't explain intrigued him. So in the spring of 1966, he publicly entered the UFO field. Nowadays, of course, we have many excellent scientists working in the field. But in 1966, McDonald astonished most of his academic colleagues when he took this public stand. But because they respected him and they respected his work, they let him be. The difference between McDonald and many scientists in the field is that he had academic freedom, which is becoming rarer as the years go by. Next, please. Starting in April 1966, he began speaking publicly on the UFO question before prestigious scientific organizations. Now, this is just one page of a 5-page list. And the next, please. And I've enlarged this so that you can read some of it. The subject, UFOs as a serious scientific question. Now, crowds of scientists came and listened to him with great interest and even began confiding in him that they had seen UFOs themselves, but had never spoken about them to anyone for fear of ridicule. But they gave the reports to McDonald because they trusted him. Now, McDonald was making great headway toward convincing the scientific community at large that UFOs were a serious scientific question, and between 1966 and 71, he gave hundreds of talks before scientific groups in the US, in Canada, and in Australia. McDonald also worked closely with civilian UFO researchers. This had never happened before. A top, prestigious scientist working openly with us. Most of us at the time belonged to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which is called NICAP. And this had been founded in 1956. McDonald had studied the private UFO organizations very carefully and had come to the conclusion that NICAP was doing the best objective research of anyone in the country, so he joined his forces with ours. And NICAP was large. It was 15,000 members at its peak. Now, NICAP was going top speed with a famous author and researcher, Major Donald E. Kehoe, as its director. McDonald and Kehoe became good friends and colleagues. Kehoe was the first objective researcher on UFOs. Next, please. He wrote 4 books on the subject. The first one was Flying Saucers Are Real, which was printed in 1950. McDonald checked out Kehoe's research very carefully, and he came to the conclusion that, quote, Kehoe has his facts straight. He predicted that someday Kehoe would be recognized as the true dean of ufology. Now, NICAP was the largest civilian UFO research organization ever. Its publications included a newsletter, The UFO Investigator, and books. Next, please. Like The UFO Evidence and UFOs, A New Look. From its beginning, it sought open congressional hearings on the UFO question. And by 1960, it convinced Representative Leonard Wolf, next please, to talk publicly on the subject for the congressional record. NICAP, like McDonald, concentrated on one basic fact, that there were unidentified craft-like objects flying around Earth's atmosphere, being caught on radar, chased by jet pilots, and seen by groups of reliable witnesses, such as military personnel, traffic control operators, and policemen. NICAP did not concentrate on reports of UFO occupants and their possible motives. In speaking before hundreds of scientific audiences, McDonald never addressed the question of UFO occupants. He figured that once the scientific community understood the basic fact that UFOs existed, they would set up a tracking system involving the military, the scientific sources, the government, hopefully, and the public, all working together publicly, openly, to track UFOs, and that in this way, the scientific fact of their physical existence would be proven beyond a doubt. NICAP, is there something wrong with the microphone? Pardon? No sound. No sound. Shall I wait to see if they can fix it, or just speak louder? Shall we wait, or shall I just speak louder? Speak louder. NICAP had investigative subcommittees all over the country. And tell me when it goes on, please. I belong to the Los Angeles NICAP subcommittee. And we often had gatherings of 20 or 30 people whenever famous ufologists came into town. Is it on again? Pardon? Speak into the mic. Right into the mic. Now, we often had gatherings when famous ufologists came into town, And McDonald met with us whenever his meteorological work brought him anywhere close to Los Angeles. He did the same with other NICAP subcommittees all over the country. And by doing so, he interacted with hundreds of objective civilian UFO researchers during those 5 years. Now, by request of local scientists who attended our meetings in Los Angeles, we never recorded them and almost never took pictures, so we never got a picture of McDonald with us. But he worked hand in hand with NICAP members, investigating hundreds of UFO reports, as well as on his own among the scientific community, and he always chose the very best reports with multiple witnesses. He used every ounce of his intellect and his powers of persuasion, concentrating on one basic fact of the unidentified AARO forms, that he called them that were traversing Earth's skies, being tracked on radar and by other sophisticated technology. McDonald's very cautious working hypothesis was that UFOs possibly were surveillance craft from outer space. Although he was interested in the subject of UFO occupants and even the psychic aspects of some reports, he discussed these only in private conversations. Next, please. Because of his strictly scientific approach, crowds of scientists and other technically trained persons filled the halls where he spoke. He repeatedly sought funding from NASA and the National Science Foundation and the National Academy of Science, and was always given hope at first, and he was personally acquainted with high officials from these sources. But then invariably the answer would come back, no. McDonald, who avoided the politics of science, couldn't understand what was going on. But it is possible that these officials wanted to obtain funding for him for his UFO research, but that higher sources told them to say no. There was almost no private funding for UFO research available anywhere in those days. But even without it, McDonald personally researched over 600 good cases. He got some astounding reports from military facilities where he spoke. There's evidence that he wrote at least some of these confidential sightings in private notebooks, which have not yet been found. These are different from his handwritten journals. He refers to them in his handwritten journals as small notebooks or pocket notebooks. I've tried for years to find them various places in Tucson, and I am going back next month to explore another lead. Early on, NICAP was convinced that there was an official government cover-up, but McDonald couldn't accept this. He preferred to think that the UFO phenomenon was so puzzling that the Air Force didn't know what to do about it, so they classified it and covered it up at local levels, and that the situation was more like a grand foul-up, as he called it, rather than a true cover-up. The Freedom of Information Act didn't exist in those days. It was only in the last 2 years of his life that he began to find evidence of a true government cover-up. Shortly before he publicly entered the UFO field, he approached the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C., with a proposal for a quiet, one-man study. He served on the National Academy of Science panel of weather and climate modification, and he knew many of the top administrators. Next, please. He received a go-ahead they would fund his proposal for UFO research, a quiet one-man study. He began a written journal to record his progress. The first entry was on April 5th, 1955, and here's some of it enlarged, if you can read his writing. Now, 2 days later, after he had written this, on April 7th, the Academy of Sciences abruptly withdrew its offer of funding. McDonald wrote, here, the National Academy of Sciences has been approached by George Miller of the House Science and Astronautics Committee, but the NAS has decided against any positive action now, will not go through with my idea of a one-man study, because to do so would be presumptive of criticism of the Air Force. Now, why did this happen? In February 1966, a secret Air Force committee had met to review the UFO question, and it recommended that the Air Force set up government contracts with a number of university teams to study it. On April 6th and 7th, a secret hearing was held before Congress and decided that the Air Force's university idea should be funded with $500,000 of taxpayers' money. On the 7th of April, there was a public announcement, and the National Academy of Sciences that same day told McDonald that they couldn't fund his study after all. This was the first of many coincidental roadblocks which were placed in McDonald's way, but it didn't stop him. But was it a coincidence? As we go along further, you can judge for yourself. McDonald's friends in high places confidentially told him that he was at the head of the list of academics in universities throughout the country to be chosen for the new Air Force study. He waited, but he didn't hear anything more. Next, please. In his early investigations around Tucson, he came across a startling 1952 encounter between an Air Force B-36 and two large, round, metallic objects which paced the plain over Tucson. The case so intrigued him that in June 1966, he took a 2-day trip to Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, intending to track down this B-36 case and other sightings that he was interested in. His first trip to Blue Book was an eye-opener. Its staff, 3 persons, as you know. As he went through the files, he was shocked to find that many good cases had been written off as stars, mirages, and other illogical explanations by Blue Book scientific consultant J. Allen Hynek. He put the whole Blue Book staff to work, including Hector Quintanilla, trying to find the Tucson B-36 case that he was interested in. They found 9 other B-36 Air Force encounters, but not the one he was looking for. And other important cases that he knew about were not in the files either. We know now why they weren't, but in 1966, McDonald didn't know, and neither did we. McDonald went over Quintanilla's head to Dr. Anthony Casiopo, the chief scientist of the Foreign Technology Division, and then went up higher to General Cruikshank, who was head of the entire FTD. McDonald told General Cruikshank, and I quote from his journal, "The Air Force is in a bad spot with the incompetence at Project Blue Book. you're going to have a lot of trouble getting out of it. Perhaps this alerted the government that McDonald was going to be a force to reckon with. For shortly afterward, strange things began to happen to him, which amounted to what I call in the book an orchestrated attack. He made 4 trips to Blue Book, and Cruikshank upgraded the Blue Book staff with a meteorologist, a physicist, and a technical engineer. And General Cruikshank also offered McDonald a consultancy. No strings attached. He'd be able to use whatever he learned any way he wished. Now that offer was abruptly withdrawn with no explanation. He continued on a volunteer basis anyway with the new Blue Book consultants, and for a while he thought he was making headway. But within a few weeks, the 3 new consultants were called to meetings at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California, to discuss UFOs. Then they simply disappeared from Blue Book and were assigned elsewhere. McDonald queried Rand about this, and Rand Corporation denied in a letter that they'd never discussed UFOs at all. Now, this was another government lie, because the Rand report on UFOs has been declassified. General Cruikshank was reassigned too, abruptly, and McDonald couldn't even find out where he'd been transferred. All of this seems to have been political maneuvering, part of the government cover-up. But this did not occur to McDonald. It's apparent that McDonald was too effective in his efforts to bring about change and had to be stopped at every turn. But he continued on. He wrote dozens of papers on the UFO question, which were distributed widely in the UFO field and in the scientific community. But scientific journals to which he presented them always refused to publish them. Next, please. He spoke before the UN on the subject of UFOs. He interacted with more influential people in the government and the military and the scientific community than anyone ever has done or has since. And the media, even members of the elite media, gave him constant, objective publicity. In spite of his UFO research, McDonald never neglected his academic and professional work. He simply added UFO research to his life and continued his climatology and meteorology work. He continued to participate in climate modification projects with the Office of Naval Research and the National Academy of Science. He was virtually tireless. Afterwards, the Air Force dropped the university team approach and chose a single university with a single scientist to head the new government study, the so-called Condon Committee. Now, Dr. Edward U. Condon, in the Air Force's words, could be completely objective. That is, this meant that Condon didn't know anything about UFOs and had no interest in them. McDonald respected Condon's reputation, however, and he hoped that Condon would become interested in the UFO question. So Condon chose a good staff generally, and they went to work at the University of Colorado, as you know. The staff was virtually all neophytes as far as UFOs were concerned. McDonald provided a list of 100 cases which held out promise that physical evidence might be gleaned from them. He worked closely with Condon's staff on a volunteer basis, sharing all available data that came to him, and also NICAP, AARO, and other organizations did the same for Condon. McDonald was convinced that the UFO phenomenon was real. I'm sorry, McDonald was convinced that the UFO phenomenon was real, but he knew that more evidential data was needed to convince other scientists. He concentrated on cases that held out promise of physical evidence, such as radar visual sightings and reputable daylight photos, next please, which showed features on the craft, like the Heflin photos taken in Orange County in 1965. McDonald studied photos like this for years. In June 1967, he traveled to Australia on professional business, connected with one of his Office of Naval Research contracts. His contract monitor, James Hughes, said it was okay if he used his spare time investigating UFO cases down under. He met with Australian and New Zealand researchers and investigated the best Australian cases. He gave talks about UFOs at scientific meetings there. And at the end, next please, at the end of his 3-week visit, he appeared on Australian TV and radio. And this is McDonald on the right there with reporter John Pierce. He looked so happy and hopeful. This was typical McDonald. But while he was there, he made one little mistake. He criticized Project Blue Book on Australian television. Now, it's one thing for an American to criticize the Air Force on American soil, but you don't do it on foreign soil. Certain skeptics, like Phil Klass, demanded to know why, in Phil's words, why McDonald was permitted to spend Navy funds on a frivolous subject like UFO research. The Office of Naval Research insisted that McDonald hadn't misused any Navy funds, and the University of Arizona backed him up too. Finally, bowing to pressure coming from above, the Navy terminated that particular Navy contract of McDonald's. There's good evidence in his journals to indicate that it was the Department of Defense that made the Navy cave in. Now let's backtrack a little. From 1957 to 1962, Don Kehoe and NICAP had worked incessantly to bring about open congressional hearings on the subject of UFOs, and finally succeeded in having one scheduled in 1962. Then those plans were abruptly squashed by none other than Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter. Now, Hillenkotter was a prominent NICAP board member and ostensibly a very good friend of Don Kehoe's. But as you know, Hillenkotter is listed as a member of MJ-12. Next, please. But finally, in July 1968, over the objections of the Air Force and through the sheer force of his personality, McDonald helped bring about an open hearing. In a congressional subcommittee, the proceedings were printed by the government printing office. 6 reputable scientists participating, including McDonald, J. Allen Hynek, who had come aboard by that time, and Carl Sagan, who at that time was not an avowed skeptic. Next, please. Oh, wait a minute, sorry. No. Now, McDonald hoped that the proceedings printed by the government printing office would encourage more scientists to accept UFOs as a serious question. He expected that the one-day hearing would lead to extended hearings on the floor of Congress, but he was later disappointed. He was told that it was due to politics. That is, the general elections were coming up, and congressmen were more interested in seeking re-election than continuing hearings into UFOs. Next, please. But consider the word political in Webster's dictionary, and we find the usual synonyms up there. Next, please. But then consider the word politic and its adjective, political, and we find other synonyms: shrewdness, practical, sly. Now, what practical, shrewd, sly reason does our government or a group in government consider sufficient to withhold information about UFOs from the public? Meanwhile, the Condon Committee was hard at work. The Air Force was sharing reports with them, as well as volunteer civilian researchers. But then the whole project began to fall apart. Condon wasn't an objective scientist. He delighted in interviewing the so-called contactees, who in the 50s and 60s were muddying ufological waters with their tales of blonde-haired, benevolent occupants who took them for rides around the moon and up to Venus and other planets, and never presenting any proof. But Condon gave talks to scientific groups about the contactees, and he purposely made his audiences laugh at the stories they told. He ignored the problem of physical UFOs altogether. Next, please. And then he wrote this article, UFOs I Have Loved and Lost, and this was published in a refereed scientific journal. And some members of Condon's staff found a memo written by Condon's assistant project coordinator, Robert Lowe. And this memo read in part, you probably know it, the trick would be, I think, to describe the UFO project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective. Now, the few UFO researchers who knew about this memo didn't know what to do about it. But when McDonald got a copy of it, typically, he made sense of the mess. Please, next, please. At a meeting of scientists at the home of NICAP affiliate George Early, McDonald met journalist, can't figure out where this thing, John Fuller. Journalist John Fuller is McDonald is on the left, unposed as usual, deep in thought. Next is Richard Hoagland, our Richard Hoagland. Then John Fuller, a prominent journalist and researcher, a scientist whom we're not sure of the name, but he disappeared very, very soon after from the field, and we never heard from him again, and Thornton Page at the end. Now, at a meeting of scientists, McDonald met journalist John G. Fuller, who'd written 2 outstanding books about UFOs. McDonald shared the Lowe memo with him because he felt that for the good of the American people, it should be made public. Next, please. Fuller published an article about the memo in Look magazine, which caused quite a stir. The final report of the Condon Committee was released in January 1969. Next, please. Now, Condon's conclusions were at the front of the 900-page report, and they stated flatly that UFOs were not worthy of further scientific study. As a result, the U.S. government abruptly terminated Project Blue Book. This dismayed McDonald, for he had hoped that the Air Force might improve the Blue Book staff and its operations with adequate scientists on the staff. McDonald had also worked towards setting up a nationwide tracking system to track UFOs through the sky. He discussed this with other UFO researchers who had similar ideas. McDonald proposed that if government, military, scientific, and public sources all work together openly, tracking UFOs, that indisputable evidence of their existence could be obtained and therefore convince the scientific establishment at large. Now, this should be a priority now, in my opinion. Scientists and technicians in the field could set up a tracking system such as McDonald and others proposed, using modern satellite and astronomical technology. A public tracking system in which private citizens are fully involved. This should be set up as soon as possible. It is the best way to convince the scientific establishment and Congress that UFOs truly exist. Next, please. McDonald became the Condon Report's most outspoken critic. And here we are again, back to his professor look. At that time, 1969, his activities were being monitored. Strange cars without license plates followed him all around Tucson. His briefcase was stolen off an airliner, filled with confidential sightings that he'd gotten from military bases. Frequently, during his travels, his luggage was lost and then returned later, rifled through. He found out he was being impersonated by someone unknown who carried copies of his University of Arizona ID and his driver's license. The impersonator had been going around for months, warning UFO witnesses not to speak out openly because the government didn't want them to. Now, McDonald confided these troubling events as he learned about them to a few trusted colleagues and continued on. He was the first to read the Condon Report all the way through. And he found, to his delight, 30 outstanding UFO cases in the middle of that very thick book, which were listed as unexplained. Condon's staff had managed to slip them in, and Condon apparently hadn't even bothered to read his own report. Some of these cases had been obtained from Air Force files, but they hadn't been available at Blue Book when McDonald visited there. With considerable difficulty, he tracked some of these Air Force cases down. Notably, next please, the Lakenheath case, which had occurred in England on August 13th to the 14th, 1956. This is the first page of the very long government report, and I've enlarged it for what good it does. This case has recently received notice in some UFO journals, but was totally unknown to the field in 1969. As you probably know, the Lakenheath case sightings took place over RAF and United States Air Force bases in eastern England, and involved objects traveling up to 4,000 miles per hour, caught by radar, both ground and airborne radar, viewed by pilots and by ground personnel. For hours, groups of UFOs came from the north over England and disappeared back over the North Sea. They were all excellent RV sightings. McDonald studied the original report and analyzed for the first time that he was looking at proof that Project Blue Book wasn't the only official government agency interested in UFOs, as the public had been brainwashed into thinking. There were official telexes from England to the Air Defense Command in Colorado Springs, and one of the telexes described the interception of a UFO by 2 RAF jets. This case was a breakthrough, proof that UFOs were an international problem and proof of a widespread cover-up, far more comprehensive than McDonald had believed. He distributed the Lakenheath case widely among the UFO field and the scientific community, and he made up his mind to write a book pointing out in detail that most of the Condon report was false information paid for by public tax money, but that it also contained formerly unknown proof of UFO existence. Now he started on his book. Suddenly, everything began to fall apart. In December 1969, the same month McDonald revealed the true facts of the 1956 Lakenheath case, NICAP was deliberately destroyed. Don Kehoe and then Assistant Director Gordon Lohr were abruptly fired by an executive committee of the Board of Directors. Now, this executive committee was led by a secret CIA agent who called himself Colonel Joseph Bryan, and Joseph Bryan had secretly wormed himself into this position of power. NICAP limped on ineffectually under the control of other secret CIA agents. By 1975, it was all over. It's all a matter of record now, but McDonald never knew what really happened. McDonald continued to break through other levels of secrecy. He'd been curious about the Tremonton, Utah UFO film, for instance. The Air Force and Condon had identified the numerous airborne objects in the film as a flock of birds. But McDonald learned from a trusted government official that the objects actually were large, unidentified, seemingly metallic craft performing intricate maneuvers. Now, then comes another mystery. In February of 1971, he told a fellow scientist, whom we all know, Dr. Robert M. Wood, that he was, quote, close to the truth about UFOs, and that he would soon be able to talk publicly about it. About the same time, he indicated to another trusted colleague, former NICAP staff member Marty Lohr, that he was, quote, talking with people on the highest level and felt that he would soon be able to reveal what the government knew about UFOs. Very shortly after this, McDonald became involved in scientific study of the ozone layer and the growing danger of pollutants. There's no time left here to give details, but they're all in the book. But McDonald testified at an open congressional hearing in February 1971 with 30 other scientists and environmentalists about the danger to the ozone layer. Now, during this hearing, he was subjected to persistent ridicule by Congressman Leon Conti. The ridicule had nothing to do with his testimony about the ozone layer, but about his UFO research. Now, McDonald repeatedly tried to get back on the subject, but Conti kept attacking his credibility in startling terms, stating that if he was to believe McDonald's ozone testimony, McDonald would have to prove his theory that there are little men flying around in the sky. And that's a quote. And we could put that graphic up if you want. Oh, I guess I removed that, I'm sorry. Now, this public ridicule of McDonald was reported nationwide, in contrast to the favorable media attention he had been given the last 5 years. This ridicule stunned and hurt him. But the same day, his final request for UFO research funding was turned down in an unmerciful manner, stunning him even more. He told a colleague privately, quote, "They won't let them say yes." And he seemed to understand at last why funding for UFO research had been denied him so many times. He never explained who they were, but I wonder if he was referring to the, quote, people on the highest level he had been talking to. When his private pocket notebooks are found, hopefully, perhaps we'll find answers. But McDonald bounced back and successfully defended his ozone research in later scientific meetings. His interest in UFOs continued, and he prepared a detailed outline of chapters for his book. But in ways not completely understood at present, he was being driven to a breaking point. The tragic events of the last 2 months of his life are too devastating. There's no time to describe them here. They're all in the book. He was found dead in an isolated section of his beloved Arizona desert on June 13th, 1971. There are many questions still unanswered about how and why he died. To his family and close colleagues, it was self-inflicted suicide. However, many in the UFO field suspected foul play, and some of us still suspect foul play. And my book, Firestorm, presents 2 logical hypotheses, and you can judge for yourself as to why and how he died. Now, was his depression brought on, at least partially, by orchestrated events, the promises of funding abruptly withdrawn, the monitoring activities, the puzzling impersonator, the public ridicule, the persons he was speaking with at the highest level? Then add his success in proving for the first time that some UFO incidents are international and classified by the U.S. government, along with other governments working together, an official cover-up. We must never forget what McDonald taught us. For UFO research to be scientific, we must work only with the best evidential data. Discard anything that is doubtful or unsubstantiated. It's only in this way that the scientific establishment and Congress will listen. Now, McDonald is UFO history, and those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. I've only had time to touch upon a few of the events in McDonald's UFO research life, but I've chosen the events that are most applicable to the question of government disclosure. It's been a great privilege to speak with you, and thank you.
So many of the same things they're dealing with, were dealing with back then, match and sound so similar to what some of the scientists deal with today. It's like, what organization are you a part of? Which organization is the best? Which one's legitimate? Which one is really doing scientific research versus, pseudoscience? So the debate is still the same. What is it? 60 years later? Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay. Now, I wanted to share with Ron here before we get going on this next one. My brain, when I'm thinking about projects and things I'm gonna work on, I'm always working on things. But I wanted to let Ron know here I am working on a piece about the dielectric vortex. Ron has been on my show, not on my show, but he's been a subscriber of the show. He's always giving great comments on the show. And one thing he has been thumping since day one is this dielectric vortex. And I thought, well, I better look into this. But we are going to do a little deep dive on the dielectric vortex, what it means, what it is. And I'm not a scientist by any means. So I'll probably have AI have to help me break this down for us, but we're going to get it figured out because it's something one of my most loyal subscribers is very passionate about. So I want to check that out. Okay, now another recently released James McDonald video. I apologize if this is boring. It's not boring to me. I love listening to it, getting stuff done in the background. I think it's great. But this is another released James McDonald conference. And in this one, I believe that I think they were able to get his wife to come and speak a little bit about her and James's experience throughout the years and how things kind of got weird and weirder the more and more he deep dived into the UFO stuff. So this is an interesting one. And then once this is over, we're going to go over an interview he did on an Australian radio network. And then we'll take a look at some of these other declassified files that have come out, because it's so, like I know you've heard me say it before, it's not so much what is in the files. I mean, it is, but what fascinates me more is why whatever organization that classified it and kept it decided to do so. I think that's very interesting to look at what they kept, because that might tell us what they were thinking. All right, so this is the conference, the X-Con we just observed. This is a year later, so this will be the second year of that said conference. James McDonald is the main topic of discussion, and again, I believe his wife is at this one.
This is according to this is the first time she spoke in public about her husband's extraordinary intersection. Up here we've got that McDonald's life UFO secrets. It's all there. She's a perfectionist. CNN anchor. Hold it. Getting those lights. Am I looking television professional? My folk. Skin is showing. Come on, Stan. I've seen some early pictures. But, yeah. I mean, if you're not going to be handsome, you got to go to the level of Andrew Weil, right? The alternative medicine guy from Harvard. Oh, yeah.
Is everybody ready?
30 seconds.
Just a couple of quick announcements before we get started on our fireside chat. David Serrata's presentation will be the last presentation in this room, track 2, and it may get started a little late. Also, Jaime Masson will get started a little later, around possibly no later than 3:40 in the next room, because the schedule, as you know, is running just a little behind, but we're going to make up for it in extremely rich content. And today we're so fortunate to have Betsy McDonald here. Originally scheduled in this time frame was Ann Druffel, the author of Firestorm, Dr. James McDonald's Fight for UFO Science. Unfortunately, she could not be here today. She hurt her shoulder and was unable to fly, so she's terribly disappointed and sends her regrets and good wishes for our replacement panel here today. But one door opens when another closes, as you know. Attending our conference this year, we're so honored to have the widow of Dr. McDonald, Dr. James McDonald, Betsy McDonald. She graduated from UC Berkeley in 1942, joined the Navy in World War II, where she met James McDonald at MIT while studying meteorology. They married in 1945. They had 6 children. She is a civil libertarian, anti-war activist, and socialist, and has many stories along those lines as well. But she is an amazing person. This is the first time that Betty McDonald has spoken publicly about her husband's extraordinary intersection with the power issues that this conference addresses, and I should say the issues that both of them addressed. We've chosen to couch this format in the form of a fireside chat. Thought you would enjoy that. The only thing we're missing is a fireside, but we have enough fire in the room to make up for that. And this will be focused on the legacy of Jim McDonald. Betsy will be joined by Stanton Friedman, Brian Chrissy, the publisher of Firestorm, and Stephen Bassett, who will moderate this wonderful special discussion. So without further ado, I turn it over to Stephen Bassett.
Thank you, Cheryl. Doesn't she do a wonderful job? She's a professional, believe me. This is really amazing. I had no idea that that would happen this way. I do feel very bad for Anne. She really, really wanted to be here. As you know from last year, those of you who were here, I read that book. I don't get a chance to read many books, and I've got hundreds of them. They're coming in all the time. I read that one for some reason, and it had enormous impact on me, because this was a story that cut to the heart of this 57-year period. And so Anne came out and talked about it at the last X conference, and we invited her again, and we invited Betsy to join us, and she was happy to come, and Anne couldn't make it. And Betsy sort of got a little rambunctious and said, maybe we could talk a little ourselves, you know, and so we've added some people here to do that, all right? So I'm going to get this off by asking, a couple of questions. Stanton has personal experience with both Betsy and her husband, and of course Brian Chrissy knows much more about the book in greater detail than I do. But let me ask the first question, Betsy. You have watched all of this go on for the full 57 years, from 47 on, and you watched it from the perspective of an activist, someone that was out there engaging the issues, right? And many of them unpopular at the time. So you've seen that happen. Of course, you understand the history of your husband and all of this, and then you've seen the aftermath for 30 more years. What is your sense about this emerging group of people with this extraordinary interest? How do you see it?
Well, I'm very impressed. In the very early in the very early days, I didn't see the caliber of the people that I see here. Oh, okay. I didn't see the caliber. It seemed like, for me, I was a skeptic myself and very doubtful. It seemed to me like some of the other people that spoke were kooks. I'm sorry to say it. But I don't see that here.
Next question. I'm going to ask Stanton a question. Stanton had an intersection with this in a history here, and I thought maybe he would elaborate. By the way, he also has a front comment in this book. Stanton, tell us a little bit about how you interacted with Dr. McDonald.
We had a very active group of researchers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania back in the late 60s. We'd originally been a NICAP subcommittee, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Then we went on our own because we didn't like to be pushed around by Don Kehoe. So we set up our own group, and it was a bunch of us worked for Westinghouse, some of us worked for other companies in town. It was all professional people. And we established a good rapport with the media, and I don't know who made the original contact with Jim, but he would stop by on his way from Washington or someplace else. And he spoke at Westinghouse one time. He met with our group. He gave us permission to use his paper, UFOs, the Greatest Scientific Problem of Our Time. And around the work table of the biggest accounting firm in Pittsburgh, downtown on the umpteenth floor of a building there, we all assembled 1,000 copies of that, which he allowed us to sell so we could make enough money to afford a 24-hour answering service and things like that. And Jim was a model for us. We weren't, well, one of the guys was an academic, but the rest of us weren't. And we were galvanized by his willingness to dig into things. He checked things out first. He met with Kehoe, he checked his investigations, they looked solid. He met with other people, he went to Project Blue Book, was astonished to find that there was so much good material there. And he had the guts to speak out when most other people wouldn't. He spoke to the American Association of Newspaper Editors, some title like that, here in Washington, down the road, and caused quite a stir down there. One of the things that characterized Jim was his willingness to use his knowledge of atmospheric physics to treat the explanation of the nasty, noisy negativist, he wouldn't have called him that, but I can, who came up with explanations like Donald Menzel or Philip Klass that seemed quasi-scientific. Ball lightning, plasma balls, temperature inversions. Now, Jim was an atmospheric physicist, and he went at it quantitatively. Unlike Alan Hynek, whom I also knew, Jim was able to destroy these phony explanations. You know, if a temperature inversion explanation required 8 degrees of temperature inversion and the weather records say it was 2, it doesn't hold. And Klass's plasma explanations were easily dismissed. And Jim wrote about these things. He put out a whole bunch of these papers, 20 pages or so, small print, double column, some of them, a lot of information. And he spoke, he was the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics lecturer one year, spoke at sections across the country, great crowds. He published 2 articles in Aeronautics and Astronautics. And the place where I really appreciated him were the congressional hearings of 1968. Jim was the power behind those. 6 scientists testified in person, including Jim and Alan Hynek and Carl Sagan and James Harder from the University of California and so forth. My congressman was on the committee that was holding those hearings, and after talking to Jim and checking with Westinghouse first, I was able to submit an article, my testimony to those hearings. It's included in the report. But Jim's paper, which I've been touting ever since, he talks about 41 separate cases. It's a 71-page paper in full text. I've been selling copies. I'm out of it, so I'm not putting in a promotion here. But I point to it as the best single paper of which I'm aware, with lots of good sightings. Multiple witness cases, radar visual sightings, sightings in big cities, sightings by astronomers, meteorologists. Anybody who tells you there are no good reports is first of all full of baloney, and second needs to be given a copy of Jim's paper. So I've used his name in my lectures since about 1970. And I have another connection here. I met with him in Pittsburgh, but when Jim died, I had a number of calls from well-intentioned people telling me, the government got Jim and you're going to be next, Stan. You better watch out. These weren't threatening. They were people who were concerned about my well-being. So I thought I ought to check into what did happen with Jim. The rumors were flying, and I'm sure Betsy heard some of them. I talked to Betsy. I talked to her daughter. I got the real story. It was truly a suicide, as far as we know. The government had no role in it, right?
Yes.
And one of the things I was surprised me and pleased me when I got the book to read was that I thought Anne covered his suicide so accurately, so carefully, so well done. And I have always been grateful since the book came out that I can refer people to it. Because I still hear, oh, the government took him out, Stan. The government didn't take him out. It was a great loss to all of us who were serious about ufology. And I'll add one more note. In the, what was his name? Peter Jennings, I think was his name, did a television show recently.
Your good friend.
Yeah, my good buddy. Yeah, we share the same birthday, and we're both Canadian Americans, and that's about it, folks. Anyway, that they would make it sound as if J. Allen Hynek was the light in the wilderness, fighting the battle on his own to get the word out, and that was frankly baloney. I knew Alan, I knew Jim. There's no question Jim was getting the word out, and Alan was not. So that was the final offense. There were other things about the show that you might think I was unhappy about, and that would be right. But that one was a totally misleading picture.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm gonna come back though to a point that he made a little later. But next question I want to give to Brian. Brian, you published the book. The James's story is out there for a long, long time, but no one really saw or took up the mantle. So give us a little brief description of how this book came about.
Yes, Anne had been working on this for years and years, and she had accumulated an enormous amount of information, original documents, all manner of things, through her access to Dr. McDonald's private files. She had a working relationship with Dr. McDonald during these critical years and had been given the permission after he died to go into his files, get out his journals, his notebooks, his everything that he had written, and put it together. And she'd been working on this tirelessly for years and years and years. And she finally came to us as publishers in the UFO area and presented this to us. And as I read through it, it was just absolutely clear that, you know, two things. One was that this was a dusty, dark, unilluminated corner of the history of our fight for truth about UFOs and the alien presence on Earth. There was so much here that needed to be known and was not known. Second thing that was clear to me was, we're not going to make any money on this. This is a good book. And it's an expensive book. It's $34. We got it on sale for $30 here at the conference. But when she brought it to us, it was clear it had to come out. So we brought it out basically as a public service to bring up this man's name in the proper context and give him some of the rewards that he was so rudely denied during his life. And so we are pleased to bring this out into the world. And I'd like to add a little footnote to the discussion about whether the government did him in. I believe he really did kill himself. It was a two-stage process. He shot himself in the eye at one point, went blind, went through another thing, finally did it, and Betts tells us that he was very intent on doing this, and I believe all that. But from another perspective, a little further back, I think one has to roll into the equation the role of the Phil classes and the people who were denigrating his work, embarrassing him, cutting his funding, doing everything they could to make his life miserable. That was part of why he was in the state that led him to what he did. And so I'm not sure who all was behind that, but I can't exonerate all of them. I think there was some responsibility for this that went beyond his own instability, which was definitely there.
Quick question. Do you want to follow?
I have
Absolutely.
a little to add
Please.
about the book, how it started. I was living in Los Angeles, and I met Anne. And Anne had a friend who wanted to do a television show. She wanted to do a show, basically, about how the CIA killed Mac. And so I had to say, well, that wasn't true. The CIA didn't do it. So, but I said, and I don't like the idea of a sensational TV show. I said, Anne, a book would be better. And that's how Anne got started on the book. And I helped her through the years, and I did go edit everything she wrote. I mean, I looked over it and made any corrections. And I authorized it. That's what the authorization means. So that's how I helped her.
Where's the co-authorship here? You should be co-author on here.
Well, she said that. She said, Betsy, it should be both of us. And I said, no, Anne, you wrote the book. It's you. But that's how it did start.
I'd like to mention this is not a UFO book. All right? Let's be clear about this. This is not a UFO book. This is a intellectual history, all right, of a very important person in a very important time, all right? And let me tell you, this is Paul Davids here? Paul, are you here? He had finished up. He had to go out. This is a movie, all right? This is a movie and a half, and it's got to get done. Don't know how, don't know who'll do it, but someone's going to do that. All right, now I want to turn to something really important now, Betsy. You and your husband raised 6 children, and they literally grew up. Tell me that's not me. By the way, have I told you to make sure your cell phones are off? It's extremely disruptive when you don't turn those off, so please do that. They literally grew up from the time they were children, 2 or 3 years old, and grew up through the period that he discovers, gets into, gets deeply involved with, and then exits from this issue. And I'm sure it must have had a very significant effect on them. How are those children doing today? Tell us a little bit about each one.
Well, children don't always follow what their parents do, So my oldest son is a physics professor at Princeton, and my second daughter is a post office worker in Ukiah. She's also very interested in exercises and teaching people health. My third son is a computer worker, as me. My fourth is a teacher. My fifth, I'm down to Gail. She's a medical doctor. And my sixth is a graphic artist.
And they're doing well.
And they're all
They're well
doing
and happy.
well. And they're all doing well.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
They had a happy childhood.
Well, they did. And the book makes that quite clear. Think about this for a second. James McDonald and Betsy McDonald not only gave an incredible contribution to the most important issue, but they raised 6 highly accomplished, highly educated children who went on to be important adults. Understand how that makes me feel whenever anybody in the mainstream or in the critical debunking world tries to make a point that the people that address this issue in some way are deficient or somehow not capable of discerning properly what's going on and what's not going on. It was always poppycock. It's still poppycock. And I think if you kind of watch things that are happening, like the Jennings documentary, you find that their assertions increasingly are obviously ludicrous. And eventually they're going to go away altogether. Now, another question, Betsy. Do you were an activist who took up some interesting and difficult causes. You are what would be, Rush Limbaugh would consider you fairly left of center, all right? If you were active today, probably Rush would be talking about you on a regular basis. You were a very strong person in terms of human rights, in terms of peace, anti-war. You even went so far as to support socialism, which in a proper context is quite interesting. I kind of like it, and there's a certain amount of it in Canada, and Canada gets more appealing to me all the time. But you were.
Take that flag with
you. But you know what it's like to take on the causes. You know, the Quixotean cause where you're kind of up against the state, and a lot of people are against you. Your husband went through the same thing, right? Was this your karma? Is this? Do you feel like that this was the role that you were supposed to play to take on the great powers and so forth? And have you given any thought to getting back in the game?
I am in the game.
Okay, can you tell us what you tell us? Tell us some things that you're doing politically, please, or just in the activism world, anything like that.
Well,
Are you still causing trouble back there? That's what I want to know.
Well, I'm a Marxist, and I'm in a political party, the Socialist Workers' Party, which is a working class party. And I do work on the campus, and I do work in this party has a press called the Pathfinder Press with 350 books or more, and I work on that project. It's all computerized, and there's a lot of work that is involved with that. And I'm on the campus with young socialists. Really? Yes.
You remarkably, I mean, this is a woman remarkably vital, active, right? Clearly someone who never gave up, right? Not a question. Let me ask you, as someone that someone clearly has a strong political perspective that is well to the center, as you watched America evolve in the last 25 years, do you see the emergence of secrecy in these massive security structures? Did you see these kinds of things coming when you were a young activist, and how do you view them after all these years? I mean, are these really danger? How much of a danger do you see that to the country and its future?
Well, the United States is the major imperialist power in the world, and it has this secrecy, it has this military, you know. So we're all up against it. It's an international question, and you know, it's the fight. It's the fight we're all in. One of the previous speakers talked about how to really get the truth out, and so that the public really understands the questions of extraterrestrials. He used the term revolution. Yeah. He did. Well, that's a Marxist term, too.
It's an interesting point now, isn't it? Because without question, all ideologies, particularly those which are intensely and internally focused, okay, which of course is a definition of xenophobia, which has many degrees of intensity. All such internally focused nationalisms and xenophobias will be in an extremely precarious position at the point that all aware human beings on the planet, easily above 3 billion, 4 billion, because there's about 1 billion or so that struggle just to live every day and they have no time for anything else, learn that the galaxy is loaded with civilizations. It's an awful lot harder to play that internal, inside focused. You have to open up, right? you become global. You become more of a unitary species. And a lot of that gets into some of the most powerful ideas that could not obviously be realized in a proper fashion in the 20th century, that lies behind collectivism, socialism, and so forth. Let's not get into the high ideology stuff and some of the heavy history. Let's just talk about how we live and how you approach life. So it's possible that disclosure and even contact, you might be back really in the game, Betty, and your ideas may suddenly reemerge in a totally new context, but with great power. Because if someone says, no, 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 nationalism, how many people have walked in front of a microphone and said, this is the way it needs to be, and if we do it, it'll last for 1,000 years, right? It usually never lasts for more than about 10 years, maybe 70 if they're lucky. We may be dealing with civilizations that have held together for 100,000 years. Stanton, have you got some more thoughts that have come up as would you like to add something at this point?
I visited Betsy, my goodness, over 30 years ago to look at Jim's papers with Richard Greenwell, who was based there in Arizona. And I remember being so impressed that Jim's files were in such great shape. You could find things, he documented stuff, he kept track of things. I mean, he had a secretary at the office, didn't he? Which I didn't, but I'm glad my wife didn't see them because she'd give me a hard time about the way my files are. Jim was well organized, he was systematic, and he was thorough. I mean, you'd get a case of an airplane crew, a military crew, and he'd talk to every one of the members of the crew. He'd track them down and go after them. And I had to admire that. His tenacity was a model for me, and in a sense influenced my approach to Roswell. I remember telling Jim that in the Socorro, New Mexico case, a woman had approached me after I spoke to the American Nuclear Society group in Las Vegas, that she had been at the university, New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, and she'd been asked to do a secret project on analyzing some glass-like soil that had been found there for the department. So I passed that on to Jim because I was in New Brunswick or someplace else anyway. I certainly wasn't in Arizona or New Mexico. And sure enough, Jim followed up on it. He talked to her, he got the information. It turns up in somebody's book, maybe Dick Hall's, I'm not sure whose. But the fact that he would go after things, not knowing how they were going to turn out, not knowing whether it was worth the effort, but trying. And I tried to use that as a model in my Roswell research. You go after something, you don't know whether that person's got a story for you or not, and even if they have a story, whether they're telling the truth or not, but go for it. That was Jim's approach. Go for it. Check it out. It doesn't always work. Okay, that's the price you pay. But Jim was the best example of a serious UFO researcher that I'm aware of. And I've been at this since 1958. I guess that dates me a little bit. But Jim became, for me, a very strong model in how he went at things. And you'll see my comments about it in the first part of the book, the first page inside.
Yeah, it's worth noting that a number of researchers were influenced by James McDonald, significantly. Stan Friedman was one of them, but Robert Wood is another, and Robert Wood is speaking here, all right? And there were several others. So there's a legacy here that extends well beyond the work of the time. It hasn't stopped, and of course, he will get the proper recognition in time for that. We do affect other people's lives, particularly when we follow an activist path, an action path. I have always held my highest admirations, not for the people who criticize, certainly, not for the people who sit back and deliberate. I hold my highest regard for the people who act. They sometimes get it wrong, and they sometimes make mistakes. But the people who act are the people that have made this world today, not the people that simply theorized about it. Brian, go ahead.
Yes, there's one aspect to James McDonald that becomes very clear in this book, and it's a real example for all of us to learn from. And I don't know exactly what word to put on it. A poor choice of a word would be naive. But there's got to be a better word for it because it came from a high place in James. And an example of it was when he began to look into the Blue Book Project and the Condon Report and these other activities and reports that came out during those days. And he would find, for example, that the conclusions didn't match what was inside the reports, that the best reports weren't even mentioned, on and on and on, swamp gas, blah, blah, blah. His natural inclination was not cover up, all this stuff. It was, there's got to be a foul-up here. There's got to be a foul-up. Somebody made a mistake here. How can we correct this? Okay, here is the real evidence. This is what we need to look at. Let's get science on this. Let's take it to the government. And when he would do that, these invisible walls would rise up, and he would be bounced back time and time again. And this foul-up versus cover-up thing, in my opinion, really emerged through Jim's work. It was inevitable coming out of his lifetime of careful deliberation and experience and evidence and research into all of this information that there had to be something going on other than a foul-up. But it was interesting to see how deeply he believed in the sanctity of the U.S. government. My government would not lie to me. Science will illuminate the truth here. Let's clean up the foul-ups and apply science to the evidence, because the evidence is there. Why can't they see the evidence? Why? He didn't understand. And maybe Betts, you have a few thoughts about his uncertainty about the foul-up versus the cover-up and where that came from. How did he deal with that?
Well, yeah, he did talk about, is this a foul-up or is it a cover-up? He didn't say it outright, it's a cover-up. Yeah, he was like a creature. He believed in the philosophy of the Enlightenment days, where if you told the truth and people would believe it and act on it, the government would act on it. So that's why some people called him being like a Don Quixote, because he wasn't understanding how the nature of the way the government had become, that there was so much cover-up of the material.
Let's be absolutely clear about this. There is no shame in a citizen of this country believing deeply that their government would not lie about something of great magnitude, of life and death and worldview and creation. The shame is with the government that it would ever dare to think that we do not deserve to have the truth, and that it's not our right to have it, and that they would deny it. That is where the shame is. That's right. It is not with those who trust too well.
Yes, Mac always thought the people believe in democracy. And so that's the way he thought. The people do believe in democracy.
They do believe. My great concern is that the day may arrive sooner than we think that they may not believe anymore. Let me ask you, have you, I know we've had 7, 8, actually we have 8 camera crews here doing a lot of interviews. Have they interviewed you at all? Have you had one?
Paula?
Paul interviewed you? Okay. Well, you know, it's very possible that you're going to get some more offers to interview with some of these teams. Are you willing to do a few more tomorrow if they would like to talk to you?
Be okay.
Okay. Well, let's take it up the next notch then, Betsy. It's possible that you might suddenly become on the radar of some people out there in the media and may want to talk about your husband's life. You think you might be willing to do that on the big screen? Not the big screen, but if they want to come and talk.
I'm not anxious for that.
Not anxious for that. Well, it's funny how when that world wants to come to you, they sort of show up. But I give you a little warning: beware, right? Because you have a wonderful story to tell, an extraordinary story to tell. What is the time right now? Where do we have?
3:34.
3:34. Well then, okay. We have to close because Jaime Maussan's presentation is very long. Look, Anne is not here. I think there was going to be some books, so the only books are available in the vendor room. But
They're right outside.
oh, but you have some too. You do have some. Okay, okay. Look, oh yeah, Granite Publisher brought a bunch. You simply have to have this book. You simply have to have this book. If you care about this subject, you have to read this book because this is the personal, the real. This is where it really matters. Okay, here. You understand this, you will understand the truth embargo. You will understand the history. You will understand what people now are going through and why we want to make sure that all those who pursue this issue are able to take it all the way. And there's no possibility that they will be thwarted, that they will ultimately prevail. There's no shame in not prevailing either, because he did prevail, as a matter of fact. Many, many great things in this history, in our lives and in history, have happened over many generations, right? So there will be a time when he will be acknowledged. But this is the one book I think a person has got to have if they care about the personal part of this. So please, take advantage of this opportunity. Betsy is going to be a little more available, I hope. I'm gonna maybe even give her I don't know. Yeah, you have a table. You have a table out there? You don't have a table. Did I not give you a table? Oh, she's at Ann Druffel's table, that's right. So she's out at the table. So I'm going to try to get her to hang out at the table. Those of you who have not looked at Marxism appropriately, this is your opportunity. I want you to come up. I want you to get some information. You don't know where things are going right now. So maybe get a little expand your political thinking. But it has been wonderful to have Betsy here. You'll be seeing a little more of her this evening at the banquet. So let's take a few minutes and then get those tickets, because you're going to need them. And please come for the next presentation by Jaime Maussan. Thank you so much for coming. Okay.
Wonderful. That was the best endorsement I've ever had any book of your involved.
You too want to get, before you leave this weekend, a quick interview with you on camera. Anytime.
Your wish is my command, my dear.
Good stuff. Very cool. Hearing Betsy's perspective on things. We've got additional time here where it's all black. I wonder if they caught anything interesting on audio. Doesn't sound like it. Okay, well, at any rate, Dr. McDonald came down on the side of there's an explanation for most things in the skies. For most of the stuff that we see, there is an explanation. However, he did believe that a good portion of it was not so explainable. This is a report that he went over, and there's some interesting points in this report on the UFO wave of 1947. Now, what's interesting is what else happened in 1947 as far as UFOs go. Well, there was that one incident in the desert. that some people find pretty interesting. So getting into this report, I was kind of briefly reviewing it. This is a very interesting page here. So this is the number of cases daily from June 15th to July 15th of the year that he ran the study. Look at in July, you see this peak, over 160 reports of UFOs. That is insane. So I have highlighted a couple of interesting things here. So just over 20 years ago, the problem of the unidentified flying objects burst into attention in a single 2-week period. In the summer of 1947, the UFO problem was laid in confusing disorder before the American public by means of banner headlines and wire stories in profusion. In retrospect, it seems clear that the visible record of 1947 emergence of the UFO problem is primarily a journalistic record. Although scientists, the military, and a few governmental spokesmen took minor parts in the dramatic entry of UFOs onto the modern scene, newspapermen wrote and delivered the key lines that made the journalist's role in the drama preeminent. So he recalls, I was to realize that already in the first 2 weeks of the Kenneth Arnold's Mount Rainier report of June 24, 1947, press reports of other American sightings of highly unconventional aerial objects numbered not the dozen or so that most of us might recall, but many hundreds. And again, that's going back to this graph here. If only science had not been so casual back in 1947, so ready to believe what so many feature writers and ill-informed official spokesmen had to say about UFOs, we might today have an abundance of meter readings with which to work. But 1947 began a 2-decade period of misinformation. So we are still hardly at the start of an adequate scientific examination of UFOs. Boy, I mean, so much of that sounds familiar, right? It gives me goosebumps at how familiar this is. Many physical scientists, unlike their confers in the social sciences, scorn interview methods of acquiring data. I share their strong preference for meter readings, but I deplore their unwillingness to look at anecdotal data when that's all there is immediately at hand. To escalate concern for the UFO problem to the level where funds and energies will be poured into the design of objective techniques of data gathering, electromagnetic sensors, improved radar reporting, etc., will require that scientists begin by carefully sifting anecdotal data. A first step therein is that of assembling reports, and for the mid-1947 episode, Blocker has done just that for us. And he goes on to say, what I see in all this primarily important is the abundance of good case material scattered through a dross of less reliable reports. an abundance that official agencies should have recognized by late 47 as constituting a problem of the utmost scientific importance. No such recognition appears to have occurred. The U.S. Army Air Force, which became the U.S. Air Force January 48, quite naturally acquired official responsibility for the UFO problem before 47 was over. There was understandable concern that these supersonic disks might be weapons of some hostile foreign power. They were maneuvering in our airspace, so our Air Force received and retained the responsibility for clarifying the mystery of the UFOs. Project Sign was created formally within the new U.S. Air Force on January 22, 1948, 7 short days after U.S. Air Force acquired its separate status within the DoD. Project Sign, followed by Project Grudge and then Project Blue Book, became the administrative vehicle in which headway was supposed to be made towards the goal of explaining the UFOs. In fact, those vehicles made almost no net progress. So one now looks back on 20 years of confusion and ineptitude, and one asks how it was ever possible that this bulk of evidence that burst in mid-1947 became itself the greatest body of officially misinterpreted phenomena in scientific history. One must read Blocker's work with that question clearly in mind. How could so much evidence be brushed aside, ignored, and made fun of? How was the significance of the UFO report widely ignored already in 1947? Historians of science are, I believe, doomed to incredulity that so much evidence got lost in an administrative shuffle and became only a first stratum underlying 20 years later deposits of more such startling evidence for the existence of a new scientific problem of extraordinary interest. So, I think what he's saying there is that we're getting, real scientific reports mixed up with fantastical, unscientific reports. And that happens like to this very day. So before we move on further into this paper, this deep dive here on McDonald, we're going to go ahead and check out this interview he gave while in Australia.
Professor McDonald recorded his talk in Sydney on a recent visit to Australia, New Zealand and Tasmania to investigate UFO sightings in this part of the world. Professor James E. McDonald.
I suppose one good place to begin with my remarks on the UFO problem is to tell you briefly why I happen to be down in Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania, why I've been studying this problem of the Australian UFO sightings. It comes to this. I've spent about 12, 13 months in the States in interviewing witnesses in key cases, attempting to unravel this very puzzling and very intriguing mystery. One of the questions that keeps coming up is the question of, are there sightings of essentially the same type in other parts of the world? Well, it turns out that there are large numbers of reports in the publications of various private UFO investigating groups in England, America, Australia, France, and so on, that quite clearly indicate that. But certainly as a scientist, I am not entirely happy with taking hearsay evidence, and I've done been down here in Australia interviewing witnesses to find out for myself in direct face-to-face or in some cases phone interviewing exactly what happened in individual cases and what the credibility of the witness is, how witnesses may be, how thoroughly the cases have been checked, and so on down the line. And just to very briefly indicate what I've found in that investigation, it's this. The picture in Australia with respect to UFO sightings, observations of unconventional objects maneuvering, sometimes quite close to ground, sometimes within tens to hundreds of feet of very credible, reliable observers, is just not appreciably different in Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania from what it is in the States. A very strong similarity. There's just a little bit of evidence that indicates to me there may even be a few more sightings per square mile or per capita here than in the States, but I wouldn't stand firmly on that feeling that I've gotten. One thing I have noticed is that lots of witnesses, after 15 or 20 or 30 minutes of interviewing them, bring up the point that several other friends of theirs have also seen objects at close range. Sometimes I've been able to check these. Sometimes I just put it aside as evidence that there are other reports. The thing I'm doing is taping. I have about 10,000 feet of tape. I noticed when I wound this thing up, and have interviewed about 70 Australians or New Zealanders. I've been down to Hobart, Tasmania. Some extremely interesting cases in Tasmania. And the problem is to try to find out what has happened in these cases. There's a great deal of reluctance to report them. That's exactly the same in the States as it seems to be down here. People have been ridiculed and made fun of by official groups, by press and radio and television, and scientists too. There's been a great deal of completely unbased, I emphasize that, scorning and scoffing about this problem, and that's driven the problem underground. Just the same kind of comments. You ask people, did you ever report it? Did you ever report it to the United States Air Force? Or down here, did you report it to the RAF? And the answer is typically no. Did you report it to the press? Well, sometimes they did, and one woman that I interviewed not so long ago pointed out that she described her case in some detail. The reporter asked her why she didn't use more water in what she'd been drinking. She was quite incensed, and I would agree with that. Well, this whole attitude of ridicule has been engendered, and I'm afraid greatly encouraged by the American Air Force investigation, Project Blue Book, which has been in operation for about 14 years and which is presented certainly within the States, and I've learned down here, regarded quite highly in other parts of the world, and that's completely unjustified. I've taken an extremely good look at the official Project Blue Book investigation, and to put it briefly, it's been done superficially and by persons of extremely low scientific competence. It has to be regarded as essentially zero. It is not a scientific investigation. For instance, when I got started looking into this problem intensively about a year ago and got in there, it came as a great surprise to me to find out that Project Blue Book, the American UFO investigation headquarters project, consists of a major, a sergeant, and a secretary. Imagine that. When you contrast that with the kind of press releases that are put out about the great expertise that's used, the thorough investigations, and the indication that only 2 or 3% of unknowns, and probably those would be explained, the Air Force insists, if they had a little more data. When you contrast the pronouncements, the assurances that there's nothing to it, with the very low level at which it's actually been investigated. When you compare the official explanations with the details of the reports and then go back and check them yourself as I've done, you end up, as I have ended up, with a conclusion that this problem has been completely lost sight of in America, and perhaps it's not unjustified to suggest that in other parts of the world the large amounts of money that seem to be at the disposal of our Air Force are misconstrued as indicating we've probably done a very large, very extensive, very thorough study of the problem. That is absolutely incorrect. Well, the type of sightings that are on record, thousands of cases in the U.S., involve cigar-shaped objects, discs, hovering, sometimes at very low altitude. There's a wide range of other phenomena. I won't take time to give you all the details. Many inexplicable, scientifically inexplicable, baffling phenomena, very high accelerations, sometimes high-speed objects moving without any obvious sonic booms, though I'd hasten to interject that sometimes there are unexplained sonic booms that could be UFOs. Many peculiar luminous phenomena, and some of them down in Australia will really baffle every scientist who ever takes a look at these. Same thing in the United States. But mainly cigar-shaped objects and disc-shaped objects maneuvering in our airspace and written off by official groups as non-existent, just as if it was a lot of nuts seeing things, a lot of people who can't be trusted. When you go out and talk to the people, you find that, yes, there are some incompetent people who have seen something and haven't quite identified it. There are certainly nuts. There's certainly in the United States, there's a very annoyingly visible cultist crackpot fringe that's grown up around the problem, and that discolors it and puts a lot of scientists off. Very true. And there are completely sincere misidentifications of, planets and balls, ball lightning, fireballs, luminous phenomena of one type or another, even aircraft and so on. But experienced investigators, such as those that have been working in Sydney and Melbourne and Tasmania and in other parts of the world, these are private investigating groups, not the official groups. The official groups, it's very hard to know what to say about them. They come out with such outrageously absurd explanations that one is really hard put to know how to sort that out. But these sightings that are being investigated include a lot of quite unconventional phenomena that are not any product of our technology or Australia or Russian or English technology. They are not plasma phenomena. They are not sundogs and pelicans and all the rest of the things that one hears about. They are beyond the present pale of science, and they're being ignored by science, being ignored by official groups, and that has got to change very, very rapidly. The question arises, what are these UFOs, the ones that pass the test of not being put aside as fireballs and planets? So what could they be? And that, of course, is the ultimately important question. Not easy to offer an answer. One can only consider hypotheses, guesses, big ifs in front of all of them. But when you look at these various hypotheses, psychological, advanced technology, hoax, fabrication, fraud, poorly understood geophysical phenomena, you run through all of those. This is certainly what I've done in the past year of checking. You find yourself ending up with the seemingly absurd, seemingly improbable hypothesis that these things may be coming from somewhere else. And just where that is a great big question mark. All that we know about the astronomy, planetary meteorology of the solar system seems to argue against a planetary, that is, intrasolar system origin of the objects. all that we know about the structure of the galaxy makes quite clear that the next nearest source of origin is quite an embarrassing number of light years away. And when you confront that distance and look at it in terms of present-day terrestrial technology of propulsion, we're just beginning, of course, so to speak. We're just beginning in that business on Earth. And that has to be kept in mind. But when you look at it in terms of present-day or foreseeable propulsion techniques, it's very, very baffling, essentially not possible to explain how any kind of objects, surveillance probes or what have you, could be got into the Earth's environment from an extrasolar, that is, across interstellar distances. But the rub there, the thing to keep your eye on, seems to me, is the proviso in terms of our present knowledge or foreseeable technology. You've got to realize, and actually I find many laymen, I really find laymen more aware of this than some fellow scientists, more sensitive to it. You have to realize that given another 100 years or 1,000 years, terrestrial technology will be an entirely different thing from what it is now. It's a safe extrapolation because you have only to look back 100 years and things like radio, television, lasers, nuclear fusion, fission, countless other technological devices and systems that we take for granted now were, of course, incredible 100-odd years ago. And 100 years is just nothing, just a twinkling of an eye in galactic, even geologic time standards. So it is entirely conceivable, in fact, it's almost probable that elsewhere in the galaxy are advanced civilizations. In fact, this becomes fairly respectable to say this nowadays. It's generally granted by astronomers that far from here, in the reaches of the galaxy, there must be other societies that are essentially sentient beings whose technologies have swept far beyond ours. But what nobody grants and what everybody stalls on and blocks their further thoughts on with respect to UFOs is nobody thinks they can get here. Well, I don't have any answers to that. I certainly want to emphasize that. I haven't the slightest idea how anything could get here from say, Tau Cetus or Epsilon or Rhythm-I or anything 10 or 15 light years away. But I'm afraid, in looking at the situation, looking at Australian, American, and other sightings, examining the credibility of the observers, looking at the content of these observations, I'm afraid that it boils down to craft of some kind, machine-like objects that have been around for 20 years, ignored by all of us scientists, swept aside and ridiculed, and nobody has any good knowledge of this problem. All these years have been wasted scientifically. We've got to get at this right away, got to get on it on a global scale, and with the best scientific talent, not just in the United States or not just in Australia, but the world's best scientific talent has to get on that. I spoke along these lines only a short time ago this summer in the United Nations at the Outer Space Affairs Group, presented a statement to the Outer Space Affairs Group urging immediate UN action on the problem. I was very pleased to see that it had some effect. By the way, I also sent copies of that statement to about 60 embassies in Washington, 60 foreign embassies, care of their scientific attachés, hoping to stimulate more interest in any and all parts of the world. I didn't get a chance to talk to Todd. I had a date to see him, but it was right in the middle of the Security Council crisis, and he couldn't see me. I'm going to try again to see him. But only a very short time ago, a very interesting statement was made by Todd to Drew Pearson that the problem of the UFOs, now this is the Secretary General of the United Nations speaking, saying that the problem of the UFOs is the greatest international problem, second only to the present one of the Vietnam War. I think that's very interesting. I cabled in from Australia when I heard that by long-distance phone call from San Francisco. I cabled Secretary General Outant and strongly endorsed his statement, except I expressed disagreement. In my opinion, the UFO problem is the greatest scientific problem, the greatest international problem that stands before us. And I am hoping to see it elevated to that status in a very great hurry.
We've been listening to the American physicist Professor James E. McDonald of the University of Arizona.
But it was not elevated, at least not that we know of. It's probably elevated in classified channels, but not, to the general public. We were told, nothing to see here, folks, don't worry about it. And the Condon report, it really sealed the fate of scientific research in the public eye going forward. Because you had legitimate scientists like Dr. McDonald here, very interested in this subject, very interested in studying it and trying to make sense of it in a scientific manner, right? So we can start figuring this out. And once the Condon report comes out and says, listen, it's bullshit, there's no reason for scientific study and scientific research, then all of a sudden you are put in a position where to study this, you're now going into pseudoscience because the academia powers that be have decided to call it such. So before the Condon report, again, going back to this paper that he had presented on the flap of 47 of UFO reports, we're going to get into this a little bit further, and then we have another report on a paper he had done in Australia that I'm going to play for us as well. So if we look at this is section 1 summary of the period. Again, this is, declassified. Well, these weren't really declassified, but they were bundled up with a bunch of classified stuff on UFOs the Australian government had that they recently released. So among those was this report. So it says, during the summer of 47, beginning in the latter part of June, people in widely separated places and from all walks of life began to report having seen shining, high-speed, strangely maneuvering objects in the sky. In most of these reports, the objects were described as round or disc-shaped. The number of sightings crested on July 7th, and during the next few days, reports began to diminish until about a week later. Only a handful were being made from scattered sections of the country. The events of 47 seemed to begin on June 24th, the date of the sighting made by Kenneth Arnold while flying a plane over the Cascade Mountains of Washington. The date is partly justified, for it was the report made by this Boise, Idaho pilot and businessman who sold firefighting equipment throughout the Northwest that opened the first chapter in the modern record of UFO activity. But Arnold's was not the first sighting of this period. For weeks before, the people had been seeing unidentified objects in the sky and keeping the matter to themselves. An important result of Arnold's report was to elicit from these earlier witnesses their accounts of those previously unreported observations. So that Kenneth Arnold report helped in two ways. One, it was a very interesting time, and to have a report like that was pivotal. And two, you had all these people that had seen things before but didn't want to report it. And once they saw Kenneth Arnold report it, hey, this guy's a pilot. This guy knows what he's doing. He's not crazy. He owns his own business. He served in the military. He's been a pilot for years and years and years. If this guy will report it, then maybe I can too. And then we see the reports start to increase. So this report gets into the importance of that sighting. If Kenneth Arnold, while flying on business from Chehalis to Yakima on June 24th, had decided not to assist in the search for a C-46 Marine transport that had crashed on the slopes of Mount Rainier, the introduction to the modern period of UFO activity would have been quite different. Shortly before 3 p.m., he was approaching the mountain from the west side as he began a turn of 180 degrees toward the south. His eye was caught by a flash as if a mirror were reflecting sunlight at him, he said. Alert for other aircraft, he looked around and saw, to his left and north of Mount Rainier, a chain-like formation of 9 brightly scintillating objects rapidly approaching the mountain on a roughly southern heading. As they came closer, passing between him and the summit of the mountains, he could see there were 9 flat discoid objects arranged in a diagonally stepped-down echelon formation, stretched out over a distance that he later calculated to be 5 miles. And, if you've researched this at all, you've heard this report. This was kind of the first major report by someone that folks wouldn't say was a nut, right? He noticed that the objects would flip from side to side at unison, flashing brightly as they did so. He also noticed something else, a detail he did not mention in his official report. As the objects flipped from side to side, they presented their lateral surfaces. And Arnold saw that one of the objects appeared to be different from the rest in the shape of a crescent. He hadn't attached much importance to it at first, as he wrote of it later in the Coming of Saucers book. I thought it was the angle from which I observed this particular one which made it look different, and I wasn't completely positive about it. The objects covered that 50-mile distance between the two mountains in just 1 minute and 42 seconds. Doing all the calculations, that comes out to about 1,700 miles per hour. When he landed at Yakima an hour later, he went straight to Al Baxter, general manager of Central Aircraft, to tell of his experience. And then the story quickly spread around the airport. A pilot with more than 4,000 hours of flying experience over some of the most mountainous territory in the United States, a reputable salesman of fire control equipment over a wide area who did much of his business by air, a deputy sheriff with the Ada County, Idaho Sheriff's Aerial Posse Department, gives a careful recounting of what had happened to change really what we understood as reality up until that point. Kenneth Arnold's story was filed in a reasonably serious, straightforward manner and appeared in newspapers all over the country the next day. In the Air Force files, the sighting is explained as a mirage. The intelligence officers assigned to investigate the case, Lieutenant Frank Brown and Captain William Davidson, were impressed with Arnold's sighting, for their report in part says it is the personal opinion of the interviewer that Mr. Arnold actually saw what he stated he saw. It is difficult to believe that a man of his character and apparent integrity would state that he saw objects and write up a report to the extent that he did if he did not see them. Well, yeah. Right? And this gets back to people will complain and say, well, all you have are these witness accounts and no evidence. Well, at what point do all of the witness accounts equal evidence? So this here is a drawing of the different objects that were seen. And it's interesting that one of these objects, Mr. Arnold said, was a little bit different. The single object that almost looked like a crescent. Is this the main device? The rest of them are, following. I mean, you can just so much conjecture there. But it definitely, like a lot of things in this subject, opens the door to more questions than closes the door to answers. Then the report gets into some specifics here. We get into different regions. And I don't know how well you can see that, but basically it's breaking down over the summer which regions had single reports and which regions had multiple reports for which months. And as you can see, I'm in Oregon, and there always is weird shit going on in Oregon. It just never ends, which probably drives some of my fascination about this subject. Arnold's report appeared in the afternoon and evening papers in the Northwest on June 25th. On the 26th, morning papers were already carrying news reports. The first two to appear were those of Byron Savage in Oklahoma City and W.I. Davenport in Kansas City. Savage, a businessman and private pilot like Arnold, must have felt a special bond with the Boise Observer, for he is quoted as saying, "I know that boy up there really saw them." The Davenport sighting had occurred on June 26, and he, like Arnold, reported having seen 9 objects, but with some major dissimilarities. The objects traveled in a loose formation, made noise, and left vapor trails. The only thing they had in common with Arnold's objects was their number. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, it's like what we hear report now. It gains some traction and it becomes popular, and then all of a sudden we hear other people reporting very similar things. Or we hear reports of people reporting similar things before that happened, but we're just hearing about it now because it got popular. So McDonald goes on here, flying saucers were about as bizarre an experience as one could imagine. So it is therefore not surprising to find that by the end of June, opinions and explanations, as well as flying saucer reports, were on the increase. Dr. J. Hugh Pruitt, University of Oregon astronomer and meteorologist, said that persistent vision, often experienced after looking at objects such as the sun, could have kept such reflections before him as they passed. Getting back on the safer ground, Dr. Pruitt added that the objects were not of meteoric origin, for meteors do not dip and sway. In a syndicated column, he wrote, AP Science writer Howard W. Blakesley wrote, "In clear air, the flash of sunlight from a plane can easily be seen for 50 miles. This flash is round, the shape of the sun. Any other reflection at a great distance is also likely to be round, coming from a small area on the plane." He also grappled with the problem of the high speeds. If these objects had been jet planes, their speeds probably would be noticeable and could fit into the estimates where sight gave the impression of something traveling at 1,000 miles per hour. I mean, that's what we hear when the debunkers hear Fravor's story. Is it was, maybe some balloon reacting to this, and it's just Sometimes these stories that are given to try to explain these things prosaically often end up sounding crazier than anything. All right, so at the end of June, by June 30th, sightings from that month had been made in at least 30 states and in 2 Canadian provinces. The largest number of sightings had been made in Washington. Runners up were Oregon, whoop whoop, and New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and Texas, California, and then Idaho. 28 and 10 were of undetermined times. Most people had reported seeing round objects or discs. Some described the objects as oval. Witnesses numbered more than 220 persons, representing a wide cross-section of professions, including pilots, scientists, police, public officials, physicians, teachers, students, forest managers, so on and so forth. He goes on to name about every job ever created. Observations were made from planes in the air, from moving automobiles, from the inside of homes, through windows, but mostly from open areas outdoors. Looking back today at the UFO sightings of June 1947, it appears to be unmistakably evident that by the end of the month there was already thorough evidence to justify a thorough scientific investigation into these unexplained appearances. It is understandable that such an idea occurred to scarcely anyone in mid-47. What is so difficult to understand is why it took another 19 years of continued observations and reports to get such an investigation underway. It's a great question. And here we see another group of reports. This is cases 176 to 202 and cases 209 to 296. And you see they're just that jump in July, just huge, the amount of reports. That bottom map there, all those dots, and some of those dots represent multiple reports, not just a report. Now, why would Australia's government hang on to this and keep it classified for this long? Very interesting. That's the stuff I find interesting, right? Like, why? Why this stuff? On July 3rd, the number of sightings rose again with references to 33 UFO observations found for that date on one day. Distribution was still fairly general, but indications of a concentration in California that had begun the previous day with 8 sightings continued on July 3rd with 5 more. With the increase in sightings from July 1 to 3 came the expected increase in editorial comment and official statements. On July 2nd, the Portland Oregonian headlined an editorial, Quack Quack. The headline accurately condensed the substance of what followed. On the following day, July 4th, official statements were forthcoming from Wright Field, where reports were being received and examined, and from elsewhere in a July 3rd dispatch from Chicago. Major Paul Gaynor was quoted as saying that a preliminary investigation of reports had dropped because of a lack of concrete evidence. The Washington spokesman added that a preliminary study of the reports has not produced enough fact to, quote, warrant further investigation. And then, of course, we had Lieutenant William C. Anderson, Public Relations Officer of the field, said, "So far, we haven't found anything to confirm that the discs exist. We don't think they are guided missiles. As things stand right now, it appears to be either a phenomenon or a figment of someone's imagination." At Twin Falls, Idaho, 60 panickers watched 3 formations of more than 35 objects flying overhead. And later in the evening at Hausker Lake near Spokane, more than 200 persons saw a lone disc in the sky overhead. The entire crew of a United Airline flight watched 2 groups of discs near the Idaho-Oregon border at dusk. Dozens of police and scores of citizens reported seeing numerous discs flying over Portland, Oregon, early in the afternoon. Air-to-air sightings were made by 2 private pilots, one in Idaho and the other in California. In Seattle, a Coast Guardsman took the first widely publicized photograph of a flying disc overhead. In Boise, a Up newsman and friends watched a single disc fly directly overhead at a tremendous speed and disappear over the horizon in a matter of seconds. The total number of reports through midnight on July 4th was more than double the number for the previous day. The effect of all these celestial displays was extraordinary. The next day, July 5th, newspapers all over the country gave front-page banner headline coverage to the sightings. Okay, so we are going to go through this interview given once again on the Australian airwaves. And this is James McDonald actually speaking about, I believe this was, 1969. So this is 1969, speaking about his studies so far.
The next paper is entitled Science in Default, 22 Years of Inadequate UFO Investigations, by Dr. James E. McDonald, Senior Physicist, Institute for Atmospheric Physics, and Professor of Meteorology, University of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The AAAS, I think, is to be congratulated for organizing and holding this symposium. I fully agree with the remarks that Dr. Sagan made, that there is a scientific obligation to examine questions such as that of the unidentified flying objects, an obligation of the public to science itself. And as the title of my remarks indicates, my study of the problem leads me to take the position that we in science are in default, have been in default for 2 decades, for failing to close with a problem that created such widespread concern, both here and abroad, failing to close with it long ago. I want to get across to you the viewpoint that, again, based on my examination of the problem, that it is primarily the failure of scientists to look at this problem closely and not primarily the Air Force mishandling of the problem that has left it in a limbo that it still lies in 1969. When I suggest that I regard all 22 years as adding up to inadequate UFO investigations, I'm including, quite intentionally, essentially all that has transpired, including the most recently conducted Conning report. If you go back, as I have done in the last 3 years of checking the problem, and look carefully at Project Sign and its contents and conclusions, if you look carefully at what you can get a hold of in Project Grudge and its conclusions, if you look, as I have, at Wright-Patterson files, and then go over very carefully the original monthly Project Blue Book reports and then Project Blue Book Report 14, and examine the record as the years have gone by, look at it in terms of just ordinary, run-of-the-mill scientific standards of investigation, you look at it carefully, I think you would have to agree that it is inadequate and it has been very superficial. Suggestions that the Air Force has put any appreciable talent onto the Air Force problem over the years does not match at all what one finds at Blue Book. There has not been application of the best scientific facilities available to the United States Air Force, as press releases have over and over again suggested. That is not the case, even as obvious an organization as Air Force Cambridge Research Labs with its substantial talent. Only in one very brief period in 1952 were brought into the picture, and again, Air Force radar cases have failed to be put before the kind of people in Air Force organizations that really have the expertise to look at them. So contrary to what we in the scientific community were told as the years went by, when you look at the nature of the investigations in individual reports, you are quite surprised. And my position there is quite clear. It is superficial and it is not competent investigation that has gone into Project Blue Book. If a lot of time permitted, I would discuss a lot of particular illustrations of that point. Time doesn't permit it. I simply put myself clearly on record as describing the problem in those terms. A fairly large share of Air Force explanations have pretty much fallen in my area of interest, atmospheric physics. Another broad cut of them goes into astronomy in a fairly elementary way. And it was the atmospheric physics of the problem that got me interested in the UFO problem some time ago, and particularly in 1966. I took upon myself to get up to Wright-Patterson, and my interest in the UFO problem went through a step function change, after 3 days of poring over the Wright-Patterson files. They are astonishing, in my opinion. Cases that I had never believed that I had heard about are really there, and cases, the documents of which are frequently quite extensive, and I want to turn to some of them fairly shortly. My encounter with the Wright-Patterson files was one of extremely great surprise that so much evidence could be just shoved on the rug for so many years and not be put under real light of scientific scrutiny. Well, the years have gone by, the reports have continued to come in, the public has continued to be puzzled, and due to a sequence of events that occurred in 65 and 66, a new look was finally suggested, primarily by the O'Brien Committee, and this eventuated as the Condon Report, and that is the last and undoubtedly the most presently relevant part of the 22 years of investigation. And to say that again, my study of the Condon Report, and I've been putting a great deal of my time on it for the past 9 months, checking many cases that weren't previously familiar to me and going over the Condon evaluations of those already familiar to me, I would have to say there that, once again, it is not a thoroughgoing and adequate investigation of the UFO problem. The conclusions that Dr. Condon reached in his summary analysis, that the problem doesn't merit further scientific study, I think is not at all supported by the contents of the report, as the previous speaker, I believe, also suggested. As a matter of fact, of the sample of cases, and I now want to talk about the Condon Report briefly, of the roughly 90 cases that are looked at, approximately a third, it's a little difficult to decide in many instances what the final conclusion is in specific cases. My tally is that about 32 out of the 89 or 90 cases are in the unexplained category. And I think that point has to be stressed very emphatically, and I think it's very significant that a major effort mounted by the Air Force and funded with substantial amount of money, ended up with approximately a third of all the cases that it considered not explained in any satisfactory degree. Furthermore, a substantial number of the 90 cases are just not interesting cases. Cases that I think experienced investigators would have looked at twice are given fairly large amounts of attention, quite a few crackpot cases. If there's anything that can be separated out easily in the UFO problem, it's the crackpot cases, yet some of them even made their way into the final report. Another major objection that I would cite to the Condon Report is that, in contrast to what I think many of us expected, a careful confrontation with some of the most puzzling historic cases that date back to 47, 48, 49, for example, the Condon Report has very few of the historically most puzzling cases, and some of these are left unexplained. Some of the small number of those that do appear in the sample are left unexplained. Others are, quote, explained away with scientific argumentation that I take the strongest issue with, and again, I will cite some examples. There are cases that were investigated that don't appear at all in the report. Level in Texas is an example, one that I think a number of us here are familiar with, that was investigated, that doesn't appear at all, occurred at Redlands, California in early 1968, in February 4th. I interviewed about 8 witnesses. Professors at the University of Redlands interviewed about 25. This was a case of a large number of people hearing unusual sounds, getting out in the street, looking up, and from a variety of directions that, crudely speaking, triangulated moderately well, indicated an object at about 1,000 feet elevation ultimately. Earlier it was about 300 feet. Estimated to be about 50 or 60 feet in diameter. When most of the people were out looking at it, and all that I interviewed were watching it, it was making no sound, hovering motionless, was a disc-shaped object with a luminous surface around the side of it. It suddenly shot up to 2 or 3 times its original height, estimated 300 up to about 1,000, moved off a distance of several blocks, seen by still other people. This case, and finally moved off. This case was explained to the Air Force as a small aircraft. There were no aircraft in the area at the time, as the University of Redlands people ascertained. I cite this as an example of a case investigated by the Condon Report, which didn't even get into the report at all. But the primary objection that I would make to the Condon evaluations are scientific. The scientific argumentation involved, I think, it leaves a very great deal to be desired in terms of discussion of radar cases, meteorological optical phenomena, aeronautical effects, and so on. But let me turn next to some specific examples of cases in the Condon Report that come from Air Force files. I'm trying to kill a number of birds, or at least throw stones at a number of birds here with a minimum number of stones and maximum birds. So I'm going to now discuss 4 specific cases that, to me, illustrate reasons why one must scientifically say there exists a problem here, that there are unexplained phenomena of serious scientific interest, that illustrate shortcomings of the past level of Air Force investigations of the problem, that illustrate shortcomings of the Condon project investigation or of the final conclusions, and that finally are just plain crying for scientific attention. The first case that I want to talk about occurred in 1957, September 19th and 20th of 1957, involves an Air Force RB-47. This is all 4 of these cases I'm talking about are Condon Report cases. All 4 are Air Force related. This case was reported rather casually to the staff of the Condon project when a group of Air Force UFO officers were called in for a briefing session. And one of them, a then Major, now Colonel Chase, from then Malmstrom, but now retired, was mentioned briefly the incident. They got tape recordings from him. These were discussed within the project, and the case was particularly discussed for Dr. Condon's benefit. But in the Condon Report, this very intriguing case is rather briefly and very incompletely passed off, and Dr. Condon himself, in his discussion, does not even mention this particular RB-47 case. The RB-47 was coming out of Forbes Air Force Base, a night exercise down over the Gulf, gunnery and navigation exercises, and then coming in north for ECM exercises against ground radar, simulating enemy penetrations, and using ECM gear aboard this RB-47. Because it was an ECM-equipped plane, it didn't have 3, but rather 6 Air Force officers. The Condon investigators stopped when they had contacted 3. I eventually located all 6, and it was well worth the search to get further information on this case. They were flying a little after midnight, early morning hours, at around 35,000 feet, at cruising speed of the order of 500 knots. And the incident begins, and you have no information about this in the Condon Report, the incident begins over Gulfport, Mississippi, when Major McClure, on the number 2 ECM radar monitor, received a signal from a peculiar location. It was coming in from an apparent position out over the Gulf as they were northbound over Gulfport, Mississippi, and a blip on his display scope for the ECM monitor indicated some kind of a radar signal coming in from out in the Gulf. That could have been a picket ship of some kind, but as McClure watched, the blip on the scope moved up scope, indicating that it couldn't be out as a stationary object out in the Gulf. He thought for a first hypothesis that this was a ground-based radar, perhaps somewhere up in Louisiana or Arkansas, and that it was displaying with 180-degree ambiguity on his ALA-6 display scope, and that whereas it seemed to be going up this way, it was really out there, and their motion was making it move down scope, and 180-degree ambiguity was reversing the signal. He didn't say anything about this to the other man, and didn't even say anything about the signal when a still more startling feature occurred. When it got up to the 12 o'clock position dead ahead, instead of stopping, it went down the other side. And that took out of consideration the possibility that this was any stationary ground signal from a CPS-6B or something like that out in the area ahead, because it had now essentially orbited the B-36. I asked McClure very carefully, and apparently the Condon investigators did not, what were the detailed characteristics of this signal. And he's now stationed at Offutt Air Force Base, where I located him. He was quite emphatic in saying that this, in all respects, had pulse characteristics, signal characteristics of a fairly standard type of a typical ground surveillance radar. It was at 2,800 megacycles. That's why he got it on his monitor. It was a pulsed signal. The pulse characteristics, repetition frequency, and so on were entirely similar to ground radar. And he said the strangest thing of all was that it even simulated a scan rate. So a little surprised that when he first found it, he thought it must be a ground radar. I want to emphasize that I'm not talking here about somebody in an airplane looking at something with radar. It needs to be emphasized that we're talking here about a passive direction-finding radar monitor that does no more than receive the signal from an enemy radar, get its pulse characteristics through a pulse analyzer, and above all get its directions, get directional bearings on it. And that's the type of device I'm talking about here. Well, he still said nothing to the crew about this until the next incident occurred, and this is mentioned in the Condon report, though you have no notion. Again, I'm getting across to you the point that when you read the Condon report, you very frequently, can cite many examples, very frequently are getting a most truncated account of the report. You have the impression in reading this account that it all occurred in the general vicinity of Fort Worth and a little bit over in Louisiana. But these events that I've just cited began in Gulfport, Mississippi, and this unidentified phenomenon was with them for 600 miles and 1 hour instead of being a very localized and brief encounter such as one I think would read from the Condon report. They turned westbound over Jackson, Mississippi, and the pilot, Colonel Chase, suddenly got on the intercom announcing to the crew they should be prepared for sudden evasive maneuver because he thought a jet was closing fast, landing lights on, a bright white light coming in a little bit above their level, and just before he could put his craft into an evasive turn, the object very suddenly, and Chase's description was a little saltier than that, but briefly it came to the conclusion that in his 20 years of flying with the Air Force, he had never seen anything move as rapidly as this bright, luminous source shifted from his 11 o'clock position almost instantaneously, as you could see it move across, but shifted to their 2 o'clock position and blinked out. So here was a light that came in a little above 35,000 foot B-47 altitude, intensely bright. It was taken to be jet landing lights, but suddenly moved through about 45 or 60 degrees of arc and then blinked out. They got on the, Chase was on the intercom and said something about this light and made some brief comment about maybe it was a flying saucer. And that, for the first time, led McClure to wonder about whether the incident that I just mentioned a moment ago back over Gulfport might be something a little out of the ordinary beyond the electronic range. And so McClure retuned his ECM monitor to the same frequency on which he had been receiving these radar-like signals from the peculiar seemingly orbiting source, and found again that he was getting the signal at this position where it had blinked out. It was no longer a luminous source at that position. The ECM monitor, however, did get a strong signal of the same characteristics, 2,800 megacycles, from that position, and he then reported this to the cockpit crew and pointed out what had happened back over Gulfport. They proceeded to try all the usual maneuvers to change speed and so on, but they couldn't shake the source that stayed with them now at the same 2 o'clock position, there, again indicating it was not any ground-based device because they're moving ahead at 500 knots. Had it been a new, and could have been another radar source on the ground, it would have again moved down scope as they advanced forward. It stayed with them. So Colonel Chase contacted Carswell GCI and asked if there was any traffic there. GCI immediately announced, yes, there's an aircraft 10 miles from you at your 2 o'clock position. So at this point, the source was non-luminous, was emitting radar-like signals, was giving skin paint return from a radar on the ground, and from this time to the end of the object was being tracked by ground radars out of GCI Carswell Air Force Base. Shortly after they first got word that it was being tracked on radar from GCI, passive monitor and GCI simultaneously reported to the cockpit crew, the ground radar by radio and McClure by intercom, that the signal was moving forward. Compatible behavior moving forward relative to the B-47 until it got dead ahead at the 12 o'clock position and then suddenly blinked back on with a bright, luminous red light this time. And Chase's description was big as a house. It had been white before, was now red, dead ahead. So at this juncture in this incident, There are three different physical channels of information coming in. Radar, skin paint from the ground, ECM monitor receiving electromagnetic radiation in the radar in the radar frequencies from the source dead ahead, and visual optical frequencies, pilot and co-pilot. I've talked, as I say, to the co-pilot as well as the pilot and all four of the other men. They attempted to close, went to full power, couldn't close on it, stayed ahead of them. They were by this time moving across eastern Texas and to Fort Worth. It veered northwestward over Fort Worth. They got clearance to depart from the original flight path, got all of the jet aircraft out of the area, and went to maximum power, attempting to close on it, when suddenly it stopped on the GCI radar. The GCI announced it was not moving any longer. Colonel Chase described it as becoming quite obvious that it was closing rapidly on it, still emitting 2800 megacycle signal until he nearly got over it. And by that time he veered a little, but it was below his altitude, he stressed, so he was looking at it down at depression angle, which he put it more than 45 degrees. And suddenly, three things happened simultaneously. It blinked out. It disappeared from the ECM monitor. It disappeared from Carswell GCI. These are puzzling phenomena. He put the 47 into a strong turn, got it by about Mineral Wells, Texas, half around, and he and McCoy, looking back over the shoulder out of the blister of the 47, suddenly saw the intensely red light come on, now much below their flight altitude. Simultaneously, GCI said it's back on the scope, and McClure in the back end and Provenzano on another monitor announced it was back on the two monitors. I should interject a comment that after McClure announced his earlier sighting, they found it on one of the other three ECM monitors. So they were tracking it on two ECM monitors, and it came back on at the same time that it came back visually and it came back on GCI. Chase got permission to dive on it in the B-47. And shortly before he got to somewhere near its altitude, specifically when he got to 20,000 feet in his account, he estimated it to be down at 15,000 feet at this juncture, rough estimate. Suddenly, it blinked out visually. It disappeared from the GCI ground radar scope, and its signal terminated. He put it into a climb back to 25,000, headed north, being low on fuel at this time, and suddenly it came back on the ECM monitor. GCI said it's 10 miles aft of you in tail position. He could not at this juncture see it because of the position of the blister on the B-47. The unknown source followed them up into Oklahoma and finally disappeared from GCI and from the monitor scope. Now, that took about 10 minutes to describe that single case. Just one UFO incident, but this involves, as you can see, 6 Air Force officers. It's a case from the Condon Report files. It is one in that category of unexplained cases, not explained cases in the Condon Report. There is some toying around with various ideas, but they don't even come near to fitting the phenomena, and it is conceded to be unexplained. And this I offer you as an example, just one example, of the puzzling phenomena that got through the filter of the Condon investigation without adequate explanation, and yet which are essentially ignored in Dr. Condon's final conclusion that there's nothing of further interest in the whole question, and we should terminate further attention to the whole thing. Blue Book should be perhaps discontinued, and last week was. I say phenomena like that demand explanation. And there are many, many more such instances. The next case that I take as an example is the Lakenheath case that Dr. Hynek referred to very briefly, but which it takes me about 6 pages of very fine print to discuss at all adequately, because it's an extremely involved incident. It occurred in August of 1956 over eastern England in Suffolk. Lakenheath and Bentwaters are RAF stations. Incidentally, the reader of the Condon Report is not given dates or localities or witness names, and that makes it fairly difficult for some independent investigators to check it. But in this case, as in a number of others, I have secured the original Blue Book file reports. I still don't have the names because it is part of Blue Book policy to razor blade out names of all witnesses, and that complicates things a bit, but doesn't preclude recognition of when one has a significant incident. First of all, one again meets with very deficient reporting in the Condon Report. 3 quite puzzling radar incidents at Bentwaters GCA station on the east coast of England are not even mentioned in the Condon Report, but they constitute the beginning of this 5-hour-long episode in which ground visual, airborne visual, ground radar, and airborne radar sightings of unidentified moving objects sources are involved. And the initial 3 sightings at Bentwaters on GCA radars involve very high-speed tracking, consistent tracking of echoes across the scope. The first one occurred at 9:30 in the evening. There are internally inconsistent speed estimates given. This is very characteristic of Blue Book reports. It is excruciating to attempt scientific analysis of most of the Blue Book reports because there was never any real follow-up. Intricacies were never clarified by anybody going back to the original witnesses. With rare exceptions, nobody went back to the original witnesses and got the most obvious shortcomings filled in. So one derives 3 different speeds for the first radar tracking plotting incident in this case, but they're all above 2,000 miles an hour. The most likely estimate of all 3 is the one that the radar operator gives in terms of the spacing of the blips, and that gave 12,000 miles per hour. Speeds range from 4, there are 4, 9, and 12,000 mile an hour estimates, all for this single sighting, all within the Blue Book report, none of them discussed further in the report, no other evidence of any further cross-check. But the point here is that on this MPN-11A GCA radar, the object moved from about 40 miles east to about 30 miles west of GCA, a track right across the radar, and that began this whole incident. Then there was a second high-speed sighting later on, but in between this, one of the tech sergeants at Bentwaters, these are Air Force, American Air Force detachment personnel at an RAF station. The second of the 3 sightings involved 12 objects in rough array following 3 targets, I should say, in triangular formation. They moved across the scope from south to north in a 25-minute period at a speed that varied between 80 and 125 knots, quite unrelated to the wind speed, about a factor of 4 times greater than the wind speed, and about 90 degrees to the direction at the levels that were estimated, very much lower than the original speeds, but corresponding to no known traffic. At the end of about 25 minutes, all 12 of the scattered targets merged into a single target, and then the target was motionless for 10 minutes on the scope. Then the single composite target, whose intensity was compared to that of a D-36, moved north a few more miles, stopped again for about 15 minutes, and then moved off scope. Again, here it would go from sort of hypersonic speeds, you might say, to very much subsonic speeds of targets that are not, don't correspond to any known traffic. They merge, they remain motionless, and then move off the scope. This was followed by a third sighting at high speed from west to east again, up in the multi-thousand range. It was given as 2,000 to 4,000 miles an hour, moved entirely across the scope, unlike anything in the realm of anomalous propagation, not compatible at all with interference from another station, not comparable to electronic trouble, not moving along a radius or not stationary, but moving entirely across the scope. Well, a fourth sighting finally led to some action. None of this led to any major action. A fourth sighting at about 11 o'clock that night of another high-speed target west to east finally led to Bentwaters GCA alerting another American detachment at Lakenheath GCA. And it is only the subsequent parts of the report that are discussed in the Condon report, and very sketchily and in a very disturbing manner. All of the original teletype message from Lakenheath is reproduced verbatim in the Condon report with A, A1, A2, and so on, and only the answers, no questions. So the reader who is not already thoroughly familiar with the format of Air Force Regulation 200-2 is given the answers without the questions. And consequently, most people will have a very little notion of what is really going on in this instant and how very puzzling it is. Shortly after the GCA unit at Lakenheath was alerted, the ground personnel saw an object coming in from the northeast. It stopped. This was a luminous object. All they saw was an intense light. Stopped and then moved eastbound. From that time on, both radar and visual observers were available. I should mention one other thing that occurred at Bentwaters on this last of the 4 Bentwaters sighting. There was a C-47 pilot at 4,000 feet over the field who saw, concurrent with the radar, saw a bright object move below his aircraft from west to east. Concurrently, a tower operator at GCA at Bentwaters saw a luminous object move over his altitude. He estimated a few thousand feet. These were concurrent with the radar observations, and this was the composite sighting at 22:55 on August 13th of 56 that led to the alert of another station. They finally got that much action going, and I just mentioned that the Lakenheath personnel saw a luminous object come in, hover motionless, and then move off to the east. Then two radars, independent radars, different frequencies. One was an AARO traffic control surveillance radar. The other was a GCA radar at Lakenheath. From this time on, are following all of the rest of the motion. It's very involved. I better not attempt to describe all of it, but let me just say that for quite some time, they tracked objects, sometimes one, sometimes several, which would move, hover motionless, then start out with, and the report emphasizes with no apparent acceleration, just shift the speeds of the order of 600 to 800 miles an hour, move 10 to 20 miles, stop again, and this erratic start-stop, acceleration-deceleration motion was being tracked concurrently by two radars at Lakenheath and observed on the ground. Finally, they decided that an interceptor should be scrambled, and a Venom was scrambled. From the Blue Book reports, one finds it was from Water Beach Aerodrome near Cambridge. The Venom was vectored into position on one of the targets being carried by GCA. He saw a luminous source and got a radar return as he moved in under the vector direction. And this again is significant. Here we have essentially four channels, if you like, four known channels, two radars on the ground with different radar characteristics, an airborne radar in the Venom interceptor, and the pilot seeing a luminous object. The report is unclear whether there were also ground observers seeing this luminous source. But this kind of phenomenon, which does occur, I wish to emphasize, which you do find over and over again in the Wright-Patterson Blue Book files, is the sort of thing that makes me think we've got a scientific problem here. Suddenly, the Venom pilot reported that he lost the airborne radar return and the light had blinked out, somewhat reminiscent of the B-47 incident that I just occurred and reminiscent of other cases. He was then vectored to another one of the unknown targets that had been carried. He moved in. This time it didn't disappear from his scope, but a different thing happened. Very puzzling. Dr. Hynek alluded to it very briefly. The unknown target suddenly, and one of the supporting accounts emphasizes that the swiftness of this maneuver, suddenly went from the pursued to the pursuer, went from ahead of the Venom to the tail position, and at that juncture the Venom interceptor pilot reported that he was unable to shake it. The 5 or 10 minutes of violent maneuvers, and the unknown target tracked on ground radar following this interceptor, the Venom, until the Venom ran out of fuel, had to go back. The unknown target, followed the Venom for some miles and then just stopped, motionless, and the Venom went on back to base. They got another Venom up in the air, but it never closed with the object. The radar reports continued until 03:30 in the morning. The account is not very detailed in the remaining part, but they finally lost all unknown targets at Lakenheath about 3.5 hours after they had been alerted. Okay, there is another single case, which has taken me another 10 minutes, I dare say, to discuss, and the point is that this is also left unexplained in the Condon report. Dr. Hynek quoted the remark about it that perhaps this involved at least one genuine UFO, unquote. The point I make is that here is the kind of thing that has been occurring and has gone into Air Force files without adequate follow-up, without anything resembling any scientific clarification. Nobody at Air Force Cambridge asked to examine this, as far as one can tell from the files. There's a very brief discussion, very unsatisfactory discussion about whether this could have been meteors. This, if you recognize the date, it was the date of the Perseids. But the count contains specific comments from the observers that they saw lots of shooting stars and that these targets were not in any way comparable to Perseids, and this is pretty obvious in the first instance. It is unexplained in the Air Force files. It is unexplained in the Condon report. I say it is a part of the phenomenon we're talking about here that demands scientific explanation, but has not got it. A third sighting, which I'll have to be very brief about, is an older one from that period of greatest report activity in UFOs, 1952. The Haneda Air Force Base radar visual case of August 5th of 52 is one of dozens of cases. I actually cited 110 cases when the Condon Project asked me for the kinds of cases that puzzled me. This was one that I suggested, one that National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, suggested, and they did examine in the Condon report. And it is finally explained as diffraction from capella and anomalous propagation. I say, look carefully, not at what is said in the Conner report, because it's about 5 paragraphs, but look at the Blue Book files. It's about 25 pages in the Blue Book case file, and you may join me in saying it is a very unusual case of diffraction and anomalous propagation. Ground observers at Haneda Air Force Base, which is near Tokyo, reported an intensely blue light. They alerted Shiroi GCI radar about 20 miles away. About 15 minutes later, another air base, American Air Unit, this is in the Korean period, Tachikawa, contacted Haneda and reported that they also were seeing a luminous target. They didn't say also. This was an independent sighting. We asked Haneda if they saw anything. The lines of sight from Haneda and Tachikawa intersect over North Tokyo Bay, the area where, as I'll now point out, ground radar shortly began tracking an object and where airborne radar shortly found an object. Pressing it very strongly, let me turn next to the radar. Shiroi GCI, which was the nearest ground radar that could be brought into the picture, found stationary targets initially, and the ground observers reported primarily stationary objects in this period. They decided to scramble an F-94 from Johnson Air Force Base. The F-94B got in there. This is a F-94 with airborne radar, 2 pilot and radar men. Just before the F-94 got into position over North Tokyo Bay, the GCI was tracking a target in starboard orbit of about 3-mile radius. The case file shows the maps of the orbiting pattern. Starboard orbit, diameter about 8 miles, speeds varying from about 100 knots to about 300 knots, occasionally stopping. The target would stop, start again, vary its speed in starboard orbit. Second orbit around, they vectored the F-94, giving it position bearings on the unknown. It was vectored at 11 o'clock position, 6,000 yards, and it actually closed on the target at 10 degrees port and approximately 6 miles. Very close correspondence, so close that there is no question at all, when you read the case file, that the F-94 was vectored onto the target that was being tracked in GCI. I mention this because the Conner report suggests that maybe there was never any correspondence between ground radar and what the airborne radar. Study of the case file rules this out, I think, incontrovertibly. The F-94 got radar return, but never got a lock-on, never got it directly locked on. Almost as soon as the F-94 got it on its APG-33 airborne radar, the target accelerated to the northeast across the scope. There's a B-scope on the radar, moved rapidly across scope. The F-94 went into a hard right turn and held radar return on this unknown for a minute and a half as it moved northeastward towards Shiroi, and both the F-94 and the target on Shiroi radar until both moved into the ground clutter pattern. Evidently no MTI in use on this CPS-1 radar at Shiroi, until they moved into the ground clutter and were lost after 90 seconds. So here we have an old case that's been in the files for many years, was always regarded as unexplained in the Air Force files, but the Conner report explains this as anomalous propagation. Nothing in this radar history suggests anomalous propagation. A discrete target moving in starboard orbit at speeds of 150 to 300 miles an hour, a airborne radar, vectored airborne radar return on it, pilots following it, no visual sighting at any time from the ground radar or the F-94, but that part of it is explained as anomalous propagation, and the visual sighting at Haneda is explained as diffraction of Capella. There are about 6 or 8 independent errors of meteorological optics in the diffraction explanation. I discuss these in a lot of detail in my account, but I don't believe it's even worth taking time to spell them out, because I want to close with a brief comment about the last of the 4 illustrative sightings. It happens to be a case that Dr. Hynek just alluded to very briefly, but my discussion in the notes would take me much longer to cover. I emphasize the sighting at Kirtland Air Force Base, 1957, November 4th, 1957, for some very different reasons. I had never heard of this case before the Conner report was published. I was very suspicious of the explanation because the case occurred at night in rain, and the Conner explanation is that it's a light aircraft which lost its way and did a turn below an altitude of 300 feet, then climbed out and went off in the distance. Furthermore, the Conner report claims that it did this turn while hidden from sight behind some buildings. This occurred at Albuquerque Kirtland Air Force Base, and I thought it was very strange that CAA observers would be in a tower and that there would be a block of airspace so large that any aircraft could do a 180-degree turn while hidden behind buildings. and that any pilot still living would do this at night in rain and then climb to 300 feet. So I began to check the case, and I eventually got in touch with both of these witnesses. The first thing that stunned me when I talked to Richard Kaser and Eugene Brink, both of whom are still with the now FAA, is that nobody in the Condon report, the Condon investigation, ever interrogated either witness. Here's the kind of sighting where you have the sort of witnesses that you most want to get. Trained observers under very favorable conditions. They were on duty in a CAA tower with binoculars looking at this thing, and the Condon group didn't even investigate them. That's true of a number of other Condon report cases, including some that are unexplained and some that are explained. Well, the Condon report goes along with the Air Force explanation that this was an aircraft that lost its way, but when I talked to the CAA observers, I learned that this luminous thing came down over the runway at runway 26 at Kirtland, then diagonal across the runways, leaving the safe runway area and moving across taxiways and over grass and everything else at about 10-20 foot estimated altitude until it hovered over a B-58 pad near the drumhead secure area in full view, and I emphasize this, of the tower observers. Both Brink and Kaser stressed that they got 7-power binoculars on this immediately. It was at a point about 3,000 feet from the tower. With 7-power binoculars, this is 200-foot equivalent distance, and their description of it was an egg-shaped object with a light on the bottom, completely unlike any aircraft that they had ever seen. Very emphatic about this. I got the Blue Book file report. It is equally clear on this point. The object hovered for a time of approximately a minute, then went eastward and climbed at a speed that both men emphasized to me and to the major from an Air Force base who did the initial investigation, that it climbed at a rate that was unprecedented in their experience. In 1969, they said it was still, they'd never seen anything that compared with this. It disappeared into the overcast, was then tracked by the RAPCON radar, went south about 10 miles, hovered in tight orbit, and then came back and went into tail position behind a C-46 that was leaving Kirtland Air Force Base and disappeared from the scene. Well, that case, which I have just very briefly described, is considered explaining the Condon report. It is so considered without benefit of any contact with either of the two witnesses. The circumstances of the case are so utterly unlike anything described in the Condon evaluation that I cite this as an illustration of the very low level of argumentation that I would be able to cite many other examples of. In very brief summary, then, I say that we have a problem here that has been ignored. Science is in default for leaving it in this state for 20 years. Air Force Blue Book investigations and all of the consultants, panels, and groups they've brought to bear on it have not closed with the problem in an adequate way. The phenomena do defy ready explanation. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is the hypothesis which I regard as least unlikely and perhaps most probable, obviously fraught with all kinds of immediate questions, but when you have looked, as I have, at hundreds of cases and interviewed, as I have, about 400 or 500 witnesses, you're stuck with a problem that fits no conventional terrestrial explanation, and this fascinating possibility that there might in fact be something roughly describable as extraterrestrial surveillance involved in the UFO problem is the possibility, the hypothesis, that I regard most probable. Thank you.
Very interesting stuff. I think I'm going to have to run through some of these and clean up the audio so you can hear it more clearly, because the audio on these is not great, but we do have tools now that can help with that. So probably gonna do that, and then I probably won't post it as like a a podcast. I'll probably just put it up in YouTube as something you can reference that's easier to understand. But he was really speaking about the Condon report there. Dr. McDonald was, and I pulled up a letter that he wrote to a Australian congressman. He was asked to be on this panel about one of his major fields of study, about having to do with weather. And it seemed like it was an effort to discredit his science when one of the questioners on the panel mentioned his involvement with UFO stuff. Apparently he got defensive. I have yet to go through the actual transcript of that meeting. Again, 50s and 60s, it's not like today where everything's recorded. right? You have to go through the transcripts and actually find it. However, I found a letter that he wrote to that congressman summarizing, giving him a better answer apparently than what he gave at the hearing. So a couple bullet points from that letter. He said the Condon report is often cited as having settled the UFO problem. Yet I am one of a number of scientists who are entirely unsatisfied with that report and its scientific content. It is extremely unfortunate that the entire UFO problem was downgraded to a level where only a very small number of untrained personnel within the Air Force were routinely assigned to handling reports that fed into the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. I have recently spent a good deal of time working on the now declassified files that are stored at the Force Historical Division, Maxwell Air Force Base. The implications of the long-filed military reports that I have studied down there would be impossible to describe in a mere paragraph or two. Suffice it to say that those files strongly bear out the conclusion that I reached several years ago, that the UFO problem is one of potentially enormous scientific significance. Yet, despite that, many persons are under the misimpression that the UFO problem is all a lot of nonsense. If they had talked to as many airline pilots, military pilots, law enforcement officers, and other witnesses of high credibility as I have interviewed in the past few years, they would have a markedly different notion of this whole question. However, the ridicule that has been focused on that problem has made it exceedingly difficult to get scientists to take a look at the scattered but impressive evidence that argues its scientific importance. That objective is still one of my major scientific concerns, I say in closing. Now, he references this rebuttal called UFOs and the Condon Report, A Dissenting View, by James E. McDonald, the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, the University of Arizona. And this was presented to the Pacific Missile Range Section, American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, on February 18th, 1961. And I'm not going to read all of it. I'll read a lot of it because I think it's pretty relevant. As a result of more than 2 years of rather intensive study of the UFO problem, interviewing about 500 witnesses in selected cases here and abroad, talking to most of the persons who have been concerned with recent aspects of Air Force handling of the UFO problem, exchanges with many of the major independent UFO investigating groups, and repeated discussions of the UFO question with scientific colleagues, including members of the Condon Project, I might summarize my main findings and conclusions as followed. Number 1, the number of substantial reports of entirely unconventional structured objects exhibiting performance characteristics far beyond the state of any known terrestrial technology seems too great by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude to justify further scientific neglect of this body of evidence. 2, all evidence points to the global scale of the phenomena. Reports from essentially all parts of the world exhibit a significant degree of similarity to rule out hypotheses that these are secret test vehicles of any nation. Many other considerations support that conclusion so strongly that it may safely be rejected. Number 3, despite many superficial efforts to explain away this body of reports on meteorological, astronomical, optical, or psychological grounds, and despite obvious operation of such factors in many reports of low evidential quality, these factors seem quite incapable of resolving the puzzling nature of hundreds of thousands of reports from reliable observers made during the 1947 to 1969 period. Number 4, there is certainly no evidence that any nation has mounted any major scientific program to explore the UFO problem in depth, nor is there evidence indicating clandestine investigations anywhere in the world. Number 5, with the exception of persons affiliated with the several independent UFO investigatory groups such as NICAP, AARO, etc., who have been checking UFO cases for years, most members of the public appear to have accepted the periodically reiterated claim that the best scientific talent available to the U.S. Air Force was being used to study UFO reports, and that the findings indicated nothing unexplainable in terms of existing science and technology. 6, although the UFO studies within Air Force Project Blue Book have repeatedly been officially described as scientific in nature, that is very far from the case. Superficial and often quite incompetent UFO evaluations have issued from Project Blue Book over the past 15 years. Major Air Force labs were never brought actively into an extended study of UFO phenomenon. Yet it is just such laboratories where the requisite Air Force talent lay. Number 7, when one examines the 20-year history of Air Force efforts to secure outside scientific advice on the UFO problem, one encounters repeated instances of negative advice, recommendations to downgrade, or even to abandon the Air Force UFO study altogether. In my view, the scientific advice that the Air Force has received over the years from the scientific community has been exceedingly poor advice in almost all instances, and is a major factor in its quite inadequate response to the UFO problem. I have come to regard this, and not some high-level cover-ups, as the reason United States Air Force has repeatedly failed to react to striking UFO reports coming from their own flight personnel. Number 8, in the Condon Report, I believe the Air Force and the federal government have now received the largest single piece of bad scientific advice on UFOs that has ever come out of a segment of the scientific community. So not a fan. Despite a great deal of publicity to the contrary, I believe that this report is not the definitive, exhaustive study it is being made out to be. Rather, I think it is a very weak study, as measured by usual standards of scientific investigation, and that it is characterized by numerous defects of serious nature. Number 9, the mischief has, in my opinion, been sorely compounded by a quick and almost certainly superficial assessment and strong endorsement of the Condon Report by an ad hoc review panel within the National Academy of Sciences. I believe that none of the 11 NAS panelists had any extensive prior investigatory experience in the UFO problem. Number 10, all of the above appears to indicate that no further significant scientific progress towards elucidation of the 20-year mystery of the UFOs, their nature and origin will be possible until the serious inadequacies of the Condon Report are exposed to general discussion in scientific and technical channels. And finally, number 11, the IAII, through its UFO subcommittee, has been urged to give serious scientific attention to the UFO problem. I wish to heartily second that excellent suggestion. The AIAA is perhaps the single most appropriate professional group to examine the UFO problem in some new and independent manner. The Condon Report and its disturbing array of shortcomings will form the main subject of my talk to the PMR section AIAA. I can here only summarize some of the major deficiencies, but will illustrate them with specific examples in the course of the talk. So very level-headed scientific approach. And he basically just dismantled the Condon Report. The Condon Report that a lot of scientists were using to say, oh, so it's bullshit. So we don't need to study it because it's not real. It's just like, I don't know, crazy people seeing things or something. Well, I think we all know that's not the case, right? Now, the unfortunate end to Mr. McDonald's story is that we heard it from his wife on the panel that he did actually commit suicide. She believes that there was nothing underhanded about it, that it was, he had been having some issues, and she didn't believe it was some kind of conspiracy. I can read you the official news report here. This is from the New York Times. Tucson, Arizona, June 15th. Dr. James McDonald, nationally known University of Arizona physicist, was found dead in a desert area Sunday in apparent suicide. He was 51 years old. Dr. McDonald was a senior physicist specializing in clouds at the university's Institute of Atmospheric Physics and was credited with contributions to the advancement of cloud physics and weather modification research. Weather modification, pretty hot button item these days. Authorities said Dr. McDonald had died of a head wound and that a note and a .38 revolver were found beside the body. A respected scientist, Dr. McDonald, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, was the most outspoken scientific proponent of the possibility that unidentified flying objects might be under control from beyond the Earth. In July '68, he told the House Committee on Space and Aeronautics that the world scientific community tended to discount and regard as nonsense reports of saucer sightings. Serious attempts at studies had been laughed out of court, he said. Conceding that this was because of a lack of scientific data, he asserted that these same scientists would not support the collection of such data. The tall, sandy-haired physicist, with degrees also in chemistry and meteorology, was already a respected scientist when he took issue with what he considered deliberate government efforts to debunk UFO sightings. Dr. McDonald held that the Air Force, which had commissioned a study of the phenomenon, was blissfully unaware of the serious problem that it has on its hands, and stating that it could explain all but a handful of UFO sightings as natural phenomena or government projects. He believed that the UFOs were real and probably come from outer space. He embarked on a speaking crusade 2 years ago challenging the Air Force Condon's report, in which most UFO sightings were linked to satellites, weather balloons, clouds, birds, and other explainable causes. Dr. McDonald also suggested that the UFOs might have been related to power failures in New York. Dr. McDonald was in the news last year when he told specialists of the Department of Transportation at a private hearing that a full fleet of supersonic transport planes would reduce the protective layer of ozone in the atmosphere that screens out some of the harmful ultraviolet rays of the sun. He estimated that the SSTs would cause an additional 10,000 cases of skin cancer annually in this country. On May 2nd this year, when he gave testimony at a House Appropriations Committee hearing, some members were ready to discount it because of his earlier views on UFOs. So just the letter that I was just talking about, that's what that's referring to. He was there on this meeting under this committee. He was a witness there for this committee. He's giving his testimony on atmospheric science. And one of the members of the committee brings up his study of UFOs, so as almost to kind of discredit him, right? Like, oh, this guy studies UFOs. We can't listen to shit he says. That's how bad it used to be. 2 weeks later, a National Cancer Institute specialist suggested that Dr. McDonald's estimate of the impact on skin cancer was, if anything, too conservative. Another scientist, Dr. Charney, Sloan Professor of Meteorology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an opponent of the SST, said that Dr. McDonald's views on UFOs were unorthodox, but, quote, should be regarded as evidence of his honest and fearless pursuit of the truth, unquote. Oh, I like that guy. Dr. McDonald was born in Duluth, Minnesota, and received his bachelor's degree from the University of Omaha in 1942. After World War II service in the Navy, he received his MS from MIT in 1945, a little well-known school. He taught and earned his PhD at Iowa State College, where he became an assistant professor. After a year at the University of Chicago as a resident cloud physicist in the meteorology department, he went to the University of Arizona in 1954 as an associate professor. His appointment as professor of meteorology and climatology and as senior physicist in its Institute of Atmospheric Physics, followed. So not just some Yahoo, right? Served in the Navy and World War II, earned his master's from MIT, and is fighting this kind of debate against the Condon Report. And for whatever reason, committed suicide. I put the suicide anytime that subject comes up on my show. I do think it's the responsible thing to put up the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline number. If anyone you know is having or has been having suicidal thoughts, please just call that line. There are people there that will listen to you and help. If Dr. McDonald had had this line to call, would we be having this conversation right now? Who knows? Who knows? So it's an unfortunate end to a man that gave some of the most pivotal testimony at the Committee on Science and Astronautics hearing in 1968, which we are going to go over soon. That's going to do it for this episode. We got a couple of his testimonies on the record. We got a show on the record. We got some of his documents on the record. I feel good about this episode. I hope you all do too. Thank you so much for hanging out with me on the Gabriel Speaks podcast. And I will see you next time. Have a great weekend.